When Eleanor Briggs handed the auctioneer the last $4,200 she had in the world for a collapsing watermill on the edge of Mercer County, the room actually laughed. Not chuckled. Laughed. A man in the back row slapped his thigh. A woman near the front turned to her husband and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Bless her heart, she doesn't know what she just bought." Eleanor was 69 years old. She'd been widowed for 11 years, evicted from her apartment 6 weeks earlier, and was sleeping in the back of a 1998 Buick LeSabre with a busted heater. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had $217 left after the auction. The watermill she'd just bought sat on 3 acres of swampy land off Old Forge Road, hadn't ground a kernel of corn since 1971, and was so structurally unsound that the county had condemned it twice. The roof was caved in over the granary. The water wheel was rotted through. The miller's cottage attached to the back of the mill had a tree growing through the kitchen ceiling. Her own son, when she'd called him to tell him what she'd done, had said 3 words and hung up. "You're insane, Mom." 3 days later, when a black sedan from the County Historical Commission rolled up the dirt drive, followed by a news van, followed by 2 more cars she didn't recognize, Eleanor was standing in the doorway of that mill with her hands covered in dust and her eyes wet, and the man who got out of the lead car removed his hat and said, "Mrs. Briggs, do you have any idea what you found? But I need to take you back. Back before the auction, before the $4,200, before the gravel road off Old Forge. Back to who Eleanor Briggs was before the world decided she was a foolish old woman with nothing left to lose." Eleanor grew up the daughter of a piano teacher in a town smaller than this one. Her mother taught lessons in a front parlor that smelled like old wood and rosin. Her father ran a small print shop and died of a heart attack when Eleanor was 16, leaving her mother and her with a mortgage and a stack of bills that took 6 years to climb out of. Eleanor learned early that money was a thing you respected. You didn't waste it. You didn't trust it to stay. You held on to every dollar like it might be the last one. She married Walter Briggs at 22. Walter was a quiet man who worked for the railroad, the kind of husband who fixed the porch step before you noticed it was loose, who packed her lunch on the mornings she taught reading at the elementary school, who remembered every anniversary by leaving a single wildflower in a juice glass on the kitchen counter. They had one son, Brian, who arrived in 1979 after 11 years of trying. Eleanor used to say Brian was the most expected child in the history of children because they'd been waiting for him so long. They lived in a 2-bedroom house on Linden Avenue. Walter fixed the foundation himself in 1986. Eleanor planted a vegetable garden every spring and canned tomatoes every fall and taught second graders to read for 28 years. They were not rich. They were the kind of people who paid their bills on time and went to the same diner every Friday night and considered themselves lucky. Walter died in 2014. Lung cancer, though he'd never smoked a day in his life. The doctor said it was something about the chemicals he'd worked around for 40 years on the rail line. Eleanor sold the house on Linden Avenue to pay the medical bills and the debts that Walter had quietly accumulated trying to keep them afloat during his last 2 years. She moved into a small apartment above a dry cleaner on Main Street. It cost her $625 a month, which she could just barely afford on her widow's pension and her own retirement. She'd had 11 years of just barely affording it. Brian, her son, lived 3 hours north in a city she'd visited twice. He worked in commercial real estate. He'd done well for himself, well enough that he drove a car newer than Eleanor's entire savings. He was married to a woman named Vanessa who had never once called Eleanor by her first name. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both teenagers now, both with phones permanently attached to their hands. Brian called Eleanor on holidays. He sent a card on her birthday. He sent another card when Walter died. He did not, in the 11 years since his father's funeral, visit Eleanor a single time at the apartment above the dry cleaner. Eleanor did not blame him, or she tried not to. Brian was busy. Brian had his own life. Brian had children to raise and a wife to please and a career to manage. Eleanor understood. She told herself she understood every Friday night when she ate alone at the diner where she'd once eaten with Walter, and every Sunday afternoon when she sat in her apartment with the windows open listening to other people's families through the walls. The trouble started in March. The dry cleaner downstairs went out of business. The building was sold. The new owner sent Eleanor a letter informing her that her rent was going up by $400 a month, effective in 60 days, or she could vacate the premises. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table reading the letter 3 times. $400 a month was not money she had. $400 a month was groceries. $400 a month was her electric bill and her phone bill and the small copay on the blood pressure medication she'd been taking since Walter died. She called Brian. He picked up on the 4th ring. Distracted, in the background she could hear Vanessa saying something about a dinner reservation. "Brian, honey, I have a situation." She explained the letter. The rent increase. The 60 days. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, what do you want me to do about it?" Eleanor blinked at her kitchen wall. "I don't know. I thought maybe you might have some advice. Or maybe, just for a little while, until I figure something out, Mom. We don't have room. The guest room is Tyler's now. He moved back from college." "I wasn't asking to move in, Brian. I was just, look, I have to go. We have a thing tonight. I'll call you this weekend, okay? We'll figure something out." He didn't call that weekend. He didn't call the next weekend either. Eleanor packed her apartment alone. She gave away furniture she couldn't fit in the Buick. She sold her wedding china for $40 at a consignment shop, which was less than she'd paid for one-place setting. She kept Walter's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. She kept their photographs. She kept the cast-iron skillet her mother had given her when she got married. She kept very little else. On the day she had to be out of the apartment, she loaded the Buick, drove to a motel off Highway 9, and asked how much for a week. $58 a night, the clerk said. Eleanor did the math in her head. She had $1,400 in her checking account. A week at $58 a night would eat $406 of it. She thanked the clerk and walked back to her car. She drove to a Walmart parking lot and slept in the back seat. That was the first night. The second night was the same. The third night, a security guard tapped on her window at 2 in the morning and told her she couldn't stay there. She moved to a rest stop off the interstate. The fourth night was the rest stop. The fifth night was a different rest stop. The sixth night, she pulled into the parking lot of a Methodist church and slept under a streetlight, and a woman in a minivan brought her a paper cup of coffee in the morning without saying anything and drove away. Eleanor sat in the Buick that morning, drinking the coffee, watching the steam rise off the surface, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt invisible. She felt like the world had decided she was no longer a person it needed to keep track of. And then she felt something else underneath the first thing. A small hard knot of something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite anger, but had elements of both. She wasn't going to die in a parking lot. She wasn't going to call her son and beg. She was going to figure something out. Eleanor started reading the classifieds at the public library. She used the computers there for an hour a day, the maximum the library allowed. She looked at rental listings, at boarding houses, at room shares. Everything in town was beyond what she could afford for more than 2 or 3 months before her savings ran dry. It was on a Tuesday in April that she saw the listing for the Watermill. Tax sale. County property. Minimum bid $3,500. As is condition. No warranties. No guarantees. 3 acres of land included. Property has been declared unsafe for occupancy. Buyer assumes all liability and responsibility for remediation. Eleanor read the listing 4 times. A property. With land. Land she would own outright. She wrote down the address. She walked out to the Buick. She drove 22 miles out of town, past cornfields and a feed store and a small white church with a hand-painted sign, until the paved road turned to gravel, and the gravel road narrowed between 2 old stone walls overgrown with honeysuckle, and at the end of that road, behind a stand of oak trees that had grown wild for 50 years, she saw it. The Watermill sat on the bank of a slow-moving creek called Hadley's Run. It was 3 stories tall, made of fieldstone and timber, with a massive water wheel on the side that hung crooked on its axle, half submerged in the brown water. The roof had collapsed at the back corner. Vines climbed the walls. A window on the second floor had been broken out by a tree branch that still stuck through the frame like a hand reaching in. Attached to the side of the mill was a small cottage. A miller's house. 2 rooms, maybe 3. The chimney leaned. The front door hung open. Eleanor could see, even from the road, the shape of a young maple tree growing up through the porch boards. She got out of the Buick and walked to the edge of the property. The grass was waist-high. A blue jay screamed at her from somewhere in the oaks. Beyond the mill, the creek ran wide and quiet, and beyond the creek, the land sloped up into a meadow that hadn't been mowed in 20 years. Eleanor stood there for a long time. She was looking at ruin. She was also looking at the first piece of land she might ever own in her life. She walked the perimeter slowly. She studied the foundation of the mill. The stones were enormous, the kind people don't quarry anymore, hand-cut and fitted together with a craftsman's eye. Whatever had collapsed up top, the bones of this building were 200 years old and still planted in the earth like teeth. She walked around to the cottage. The door was already open. She stepped onto the porch, careful of the rotted boards, and looked inside. A small main room with a stone fireplace. A back room that had probably been a bedroom. A lean-to kitchen with a hand pump still attached to the sink. The maple tree growing through the porch had not yet reached the interior walls. The plaster was peeling, but the timbers were sound. Eleanor stood in that cottage in her widow's coat and her cracked shoes, and she heard Walter's voice in her head, the way she still heard it sometimes when she was trying to make a decision. "You don't need much, Ellie. You never did." She drove back into town. She called the county clerk. She asked how the tax sale worked. The clerk explained the process. Eleanor would need to register, attend the auction in person, and bid against any other interested parties. The minimum bid was $3,500. Most properties of this type, the clerk said, attracted no bidders at all and reverted to the county. "What's the catch?" Eleanor asked. The clerk laughed gently. "Ma'am, the catch is the property. Nobody wants it. It's been on the rolls for 14 years. Eleanor went to the auction the next Wednesday. There were 6 other people in the room. 2 were investors looking at a different parcel. 3 were neighbors of other properties, hoping to pick up adjacent strips of land. The 6th was a man in a polo shirt who Eleanor would later learn was a local developer who came to every tax sale just in case something good came up. When the watermill came up, Eleanor raised her paddle at $3,500. The man in the polo shirt looked over at her, raised his eyebrows, and bid $3,700. Eleanor's hand shook, but she raised the paddle again. $3,800. The man bid $4,000. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of the Buick. She thought of the parking lot. She thought of the woman with the paper cup of coffee. She thought of Walter saying, "You don't need much, Ellie, you never did." She bid $4,200. The man in the polo shirt studied her for a long moment. He looked at his phone. He looked back at her. Then he set his paddle down and shook his head with a small smile. "All yours, ma'am," he said. That's when the laugh started. Not from him. He was kind enough. But from the rest of the room. The man who slapped his thigh. The woman who said, "Bless her heart." The clerk who couldn't quite keep the smile off her face when she handed Eleanor the paperwork. Eleanor signed everything. She wrote a check for $4,200 that emptied her savings down to $217. She walked out into the parking lot with the deed to a watermill in her hand and sat in the Buick for 15 minutes, just breathing, just holding the paper. Then she drove to the property. She drove past the oak trees and parked the Buick on the gravel and got out and stood looking at the building that was now, legally and entirely, hers. "Well, Walter," she said out loud, "I bought a mill." She called Brian that night from a parking lot outside a McDonald's because the property had no cell signal. "Mom, what?" "I bought a property. I have a place to live." "You bought what? Where?" "It's called the Old Hadley Mill. It's about 20 miles east of town. I'm going to fix up the cottage and live there." There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough Eleanor wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, what did you pay for it?" $4,200. "You're insane, Mom." The line went dead. Eleanor sat in the McDonald's parking lot for a while. She watched a family inside the restaurant through the window. A young mother and 2 small children eating French fries and laughing about something. The mother kept reaching across the table to wipe ketchup off the smaller child's chin. The child kept pulling away and giggling. Eleanor turned the Buick on and drove back to the mill. She slept in the cottage that first night. She dragged a sleeping bag and a foam pad from the Buick, set them up in the front room near the fireplace, and laid down on the floor in her clothes. The floor was cold. The wind came through the broken window of the main room. Somewhere in the rafters something moved that might have been a bird or might have been a mouse. Eleanor lay on her back and looked up at the timbers of a ceiling that had stood for 200 years. She thought about all the people who had slept in this room before her. The original miller who built it. His wife. His children. The family that came after them. The last family that lived here before the mill went out of business in 1971. All those people, building their lives inside these walls. And now her. She slept. In the morning, she woke before dawn. She pumped water from the hand pump in the kitchen, and to her surprise, after about 30 pumps of dry handle, water came up clear and cold. She washed her face with it. She made instant coffee on a small camp stove she'd kept in the Buick for years and never used. Then she walked the property. The mill itself was a wreck, but it was a magnificent wreck. The grindstones, 2 of them, sat on the main floor like stone planets, each one 4 feet across and a foot thick. The gearing that had connected the water wheel to the stones still hung from the ceiling in places, oak beams as thick as Eleanor's waist, bolted with iron. Whoever had built this had built it to outlast empires. She climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, testing each step before she put her weight on it. The second floor was a granary, where corn and wheat had been stored. The roof was caved in here, and morning light came down through the hole in shafts of gold dust. Eleanor stood in those shafts of light, smelling old grain and old wood, and the faint mineral smell of stone, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. This was hers. Whatever else happened, whatever it took to fix it, whatever everyone in town thought of her, this was hers. On the third floor, what had once been a hoist room, she found something she didn't expect. Tucked into the corner, under a fallen roof beam, was a small wooden chest. Not large, maybe the size of a bread box. Eleanor moved the beam carefully and crouched down to examine it. The chest was iron-banded oak, blackened with age but solid. It had a small lock on the front, rusted shut. Eleanor brushed dirt and rodent droppings off the lid and saw, faintly carved into the wood, the initials J.H. She tried to lift the chest. It was heavy, heavier than empty which should be. She tried the lock. It wouldn't budge. Eleanor sat back on her heels and stared at the chest for a long moment. Then she stood up. She left the chest where it was. She walked back down the stairs to the cottage, made. Parties. The minimum bid was $3,500. Most properties of this type, the clerk said, attracted no bidders at all and reverted to the county. What's the catch? Eleanor asked. The clerk laughed gently. Ma'am, the catch is the property. Nobody wants it. It's been on the rolls for 14 years. Eleanor went to the auction the next Wednesday. There were 6 other people in the room. 2 were investors looking at a different parcel. 3 were neighbors of other properties, hoping to pick up adjacent strips of land. The 6th was a man in a polo shirt who Eleanor would later learn was a local developer who came to every tax sale just in case something good came up. When the watermill came up, Eleanor raised her paddle at $3,500. The man in the polo shirt looked over at her, raised his eyebrows, and bid $3,700. Eleanor's hand shook, but she raised the paddle again. $3,800. The man bid $4,000. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of the Buick. She thought of the parking lot. She thought of the woman with the paper cup of coffee. She thought of Walter saying, "You don't need much, Ellie, you never did." She bid $4,200. The man in the polo shirt studied her for a long moment. He looked at his phone. He looked back at her. Then he set his paddle down and shook his head with a small smile. "All yours, ma'am," he said. That's when the laugh started. Not from him. He was kind enough. But from the rest of the room. The man who slapped his thigh. The woman who said, "Bless her heart." The clerk who couldn't quite keep the smile off her face when she handed Eleanor the paperwork. Eleanor signed everything. She wrote a check for $4,200 that emptied her savings down to $217. She walked out into the parking lot with the deed to a watermill in her hand and sat in the Buick for 15 minutes, just breathing, just holding the paper. Then she drove to the property. She drove past the oak trees and parked the Buick on the gravel and got out and stood looking at the building that was now, legally and entirely, hers. "Well, Walter," she said out loud, "I bought a mill." She called Brian that night from a parking lot outside of McDonald's because the property had no cell signal. "Mom, what?" "I bought a property. I have a place to live." "You bought what? Where?" "It's called the Old Hadley Mill. It's about 20 miles east of town." I'm going to fix up the cottage and live there." There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough Eleanor wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, what did you pay for it?" $4,200. "You're insane, Mom." The line went dead. Eleanor sat in the McDonald's parking lot for a while. She watched a family inside the restaurant through the window. A young mother and two small children eating French fries and laughing about something. The mother kept reaching across the table to wipe ketchup off the smaller child's chin. The child kept pulling away and giggling. Eleanor turned the Buick on and drove back to the mill. She slept in the cottage that first night. She dragged a sleeping bag and a foam pad from the Buick, set them up in the front room near the fireplace, and laid down on the floor in her clothes. The floor was cold. The wind came through the broken window of the main room. Somewhere in the rafters something moved that might have been a bird or might have been a mouse. Eleanor lay on her back and looked up at the timbers of a ceiling that had stood for 200 years. She thought about all the people who had slept in this room before her. The original miller who built it. His wife. His children. The family that came after them. The last family that lived here before the mill went out of business in 1971. All those people, building their lives inside these walls. And now her. She slept. In the morning, she woke before dawn. She pumped water from the hand pump in the kitchen, and to her surprise, after about 30 pumps of dry handle, water came up clear and cold. She washed her face with it. She made instant coffee on a small camp stove she'd kept in the Buick for years and never used. Then she walked the property. The mill itself was a wreck, but it was a magnificent wreck. The grindstones, 2 of them, sat on the main floor like stone planets, each one 4 feet across and a foot thick. The gearing that had connected the water wheel to the stones still hung from the ceiling in places, oak beams as thick as Eleanor's waist, bolted with iron. Whoever had built this had built it to outlast empires. She climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, testing each step before she put her weight on it. The second floor was a granary, where corn and wheat had been stored. The roof was caved in here, and morning light came down through the hole in shafts of gold dust. Eleanor stood in those shafts of light, smelling old grain and old wood, and the faint mineral smell of stone, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. This was hers. Whatever else happened, whatever it took to fix it, whatever everyone in town thought of her, this was hers. On the third floor, what had once been a hoist room, she found something she didn't expect. Tucked into the corner, under a fallen roof beam, was a small wooden chest. Not large, maybe the size of a bread box. Eleanor moved the beam carefully and crouched down to examine it. The chest was iron-banded oak, blackened with age but solid. It had a small lock on the front, rusted shut. Eleanor brushed dirt and rodent droppings off the lid and saw, faintly carved into the wood, the initials J.H. She tried to lift the chest. It was heavy, heavier than empty which should be. She tried the lock. It wouldn't budge. Eleanor sat back on her heels and stared at the chest for a long moment. Then she stood up. She left the chest where it was. She walked back down the stairs to the cottage, had bought a Watermill for $4,200. She had been laughed at by an entire room of strangers. Her son had called her insane and hung up. And on the third floor of her Watermill, in a chest carved with the initials of a man who had died over 100 years ago, was a piece of American history that did not, in any way she could understand, belong to her. It belonged to history. It belonged to the descendants of Samuel and Hannah Green, if any could be found. It belonged to a museum, maybe. It belonged to a story that was bigger than Eleanor Briggs and her empty checking account. But for this moment, on this morning, in this building that no one had wanted, the chest was here, and she was here, and that meant something. She stood up. Her knees protested. She picked up the chest, carried it carefully down 2 flights of stairs, and brought it into the cottage. She set it on the small wooden table by the fireplace. Then she walked outside, sat on the broken porch step, and looked at the property that was, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, hers. The water wheel turned slightly in the current, even broken, even rotted. The creek ran past, the same creek that had run past for 200 years, the same creek that had carried the wheel that had ground the grain that had fed the families that had built the town that had eventually forgotten this place existed. Eleanor watched the water move. She thought, for the first time in a long time, about what came next. She would need to clean the cottage. She would need to repair the roof of the cottage at least, even if the mill itself stayed a ruin for a while. She would need food and supplies and a way to get into town. She would need to, at some point, decide what to do about the chest. But for right now, on this morning, in this place, she had a home. For the first time in 6 weeks, she had a home. She sat on the porch step until the sun was high enough to warm her shoulders, and then she went inside, found a broom in the lean-to kitchen that was older than she was, and began to sweep. She swept for 3 hours. By the time she finished, she could see the floor of the cottage for the first time, and the floor was beautiful. Wide planks of heart pine, hand-pegged, worn smooth by 175 years of feet. She stood in the middle of the cottage with the broom in her hand and tears in her eyes again. But they were a different kind of tears. She had a floor. She had walls. She had a roof, mostly. She had water from the pump. She had a fireplace that, she hoped, would draw properly once she cleaned the chimney. And she had a chest on her table that she did not yet know what to do with. She decided, for the moment, that she didn't have to know. She decided, for the moment, that the only thing she had to do was the next thing in front of her. The next thing in front of her was the broken window in the front room. Eleanor walked outside, looked at the window, and started looking for something she could use to board it up until she could afford glass. That was how she met Henry Aldridge. Henry Aldridge was 71 years old, lived 2 miles down Old Forge Road in a farmhouse that had been in his family since 1893, and drove a green 1986 Ford pickup truck that had more rust than paint. He'd seen Eleanor's Buick at the Watermill that morning when he'd driven into town for his mail, and on his way back, around noon, he pulled up the gravel drive and stopped his truck about 30 feet from the cottage, the way a man does when he doesn't want to startle anyone. He got out slowly. He was tall, lean, weather-burned. He wore a flannel shirt and work pants and a cap that said Hadley Grain and Feed, EST 1922. Afternoon, he called. Eleanor turned from the broken window where she'd been measuring with her hands. Afternoon. You the lady who bought the mill? I am. Henry walked a few steps closer. He looked at the mill, at the cottage, at the Buick, at Eleanor. He looked back at the mill. He took his cap off, rubbed his head, put the cap back on. Well, he said, I'll be damned. That's about the response I've been getting, Eleanor said. Henry looked at her again. Something in her voice, dry and tired and unbroken, made him smile a small smile. My name's Henry Aldridge. I live down the road about 2 miles. My great-grandfather sold this mill to the Hadley family in 1889. Eleanor went very still. Your great-grandfather what? Sold it. To Josiah Hadley's son. After Josiah passed. My family owned the mill before the Hadleys did. Briefly. About 12 years. My great-grandfather bought it at auction in 1877 and sold it in 1889 because he couldn't make it pay. Eleanor took a step toward Henry. Mr. Aldridge, would you come inside? I need to show you something. Henry hesitated. Then he nodded. He followed her into the cottage, took off his cap again at the door, and stopped when he saw the small, iron-banded chest on the table. Eleanor watched his face. Henry looked at the chest for a long time. He didn't say anything. You know that chest? Eleanor asked. I know those initials, Henry said. J.H., Josiah Hadley. Eleanor opened the chest. Henry Aldridge looked inside, and the color drained out of his face. He sat down slowly on the second chair at the table. He took off his cap and held it in both hands. My grandfather told me a story when I was a boy, Henry said quietly. He said his father told him that when they sold the mill in 1889, the Hadley family said there were things in the building that didn't belong to them, things they were keeping safe. He said his father always wondered what they meant, always wondered if there was something hidden somewhere. He searched the mill himself when he was a young man, never found anything. Henry looked up at Eleanor. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Where did you find this? 3rd floor. Under a fallen roof beam. In the corner of the hoist room. Henry let out a long, slow breath. My great-grandfather couldn't read very well, he said. He wouldn't have known what the ledger was even if he'd found it. He probably walked past this chest a dozen times. Eleanor looked down at the ledger. She lifted it gently out of the chest and set it on the table. Mr. Aldridge, Henry. Henry, this isn't just a chest of old things. The ledger. The back of the ledger. It documents this building as a station on the Underground Railroad. Josiah Hadley sheltered escaped slaves here. The papers and the coins were left in trust with him by a family he helped. Henry stared at the ledger. My great-grandfather, he said slowly, fought in the Union Army. He was at Antietam. He was at Gettysburg. He came home and he scraped together every dollar he had, and he bought this mill at auction in 1877 because, the story goes, he wanted to live somewhere that meant something. He never said what it meant. He died when my father was a small boy. Henry put his hands flat on the table. He bought this place because he knew, didn't he? Somehow he knew. I don't know, Eleanor said. But I think maybe. They sat in silence for a long while. The afternoon light moved across the table. The chest sat between them. Finally Henry said, Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor, you can't keep this. You know that, right? I know. This needs to go to the right people. Historians. Maybe descendants, if any can be found. I know. That said, Henry paused. That said, you also can't just give it away. There's a process. There's a value here. Not just historical value. Real money, probably. Those coins alone. I'm not trying to keep the money. I know you're not. I can see that on your face. Henry studied her. Eleanor, can I ask, why did you buy this place? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. About the apartment above the dry cleaner. About the rent increase. About Brian and his guest room. About the Buick. About the parking lots. About the woman with the paper cup of coffee. Henry listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at his cap. Then he stood up. Eleanor, I'm going to drive home. I'm going to make some phone calls. I'm going to come back tomorrow morning with my truck and some materials, and we're going to start by boarding up that window and patching the roof of this cottage so you don't freeze the first time it rains. Then we're going to start figuring out what to do about what's in that chest. That all right with you? Eleanor looked at him. Why, she said. Why would you do that? Henry Aldridge put his cap back on. He looked out the open door at the watermill on the bank of Hadley's Run, the building his great-grandfather had bought because it meant something. Because somebody has to, he said. Then he walked out to his truck, and Eleanor stood in the doorway of her cottage and watched the green Ford pickup drive away down the gravel road, and the sun was starting to slant toward late afternoon. She went back inside. She closed the lid of the chest. She did not, for a long while, do anything else. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her, and she thought about Samuel and Hannah Green. She thought about the words on the note. In gratitude for our lives and the lives of our children. She thought about what it must have been like for them to walk into this mill, knowing they could be sent back if anyone with the wrong intentions came up the gravel road. Knowing that the miller who took them in was risking his own life and his family's lives. Knowing that the only thing standing between them and a return to slavery was one stranger and his decision to be brave. And she thought about Josiah Hadley, sitting in this same cottage, maybe at this same table, writing those entries in his ledger by candlelight. Family of 4. Sent on to W. Junction. Godspeed them. She thought about him keeping the chest hidden. She thought about him passing it down to his son with instructions, and the son never quite finding the right moment to do something with it. In time burying it under fallen beams until 161 years had passed, and an old woman with $217 in her checking account opened a lid and saw what had been waiting. Eleanor pressed her palms against her eyes. She had spent her whole life being practical. She had balanced a household budget down to the penny. She had counted the cost of every decision before she made it. She had taught second graders to be careful with their pencils because pencils cost money and money did not grow on trees. And here, in front of her, was something that could not be measured in pennies. She got up. She walked outside again. She walked down to the creek and stood at the edge of the water where the broken water wheel hung in its frame. The current ran past, brown and quiet, the same water that had turned this wheel for over 100 years until 1971 when the mill closed and the wheel stopped and the building started its long, slow surrender to time. But the building had not surrendered. The bones had held. Eleanor walked back up to the cottage. She found a small notebook in the Buick, the kind she'd kept in her purse for years to write down grocery lists, and she sat at the table and started writing. Things to do, she wrote at the top of the first page. Board up windows. Patch cottage roof. Clean chimney. Find lawyer who knows about historical artifacts. Find historian who knows about the Underground Railroad in this county. Find descendants of Samuel and Hannah Green, if any can be found. Do not, under any circumstances, tell anyone in town what is in the chest until I know what I am doing. She underlined the last item 3 times. She closed the notebook. She made herself a simple supper from supplies she had in the Buick. A can of soup heated on the camp stove. A piece of bread. A cup of tea. She ate sitting on the porch step, watching the light fade over the meadow on the far side of the creek. Bats came out in the dusk and chased mosquitoes. Frogs started up their evening chorus in the reeds along the bank. Somewhere far off, a whippoorwill began calling. Eleanor had not heard a whippoorwill since she was a girl on her grandmother's farm. She listened to it for a long time. When it got fully dark, she went inside, banked her sleeping bag near the fireplace, and lay down. She did not sleep right away. She lay on her back looking up at the timbers and thinking. She thought about Brian. She thought about the moment on the phone when he had said, "You're insane, Mom," and hung up. She had felt small when he said that. She had felt foolish. She did not feel foolish now. She felt, for the first time in 11 years, like she was where she was supposed to be. She did not know yet what would happen with the chest. She did not know yet how Henry Aldridge was going to help her or who he was going to call. She did not know what the next day would bring or the day after that. But she knew that she had walked into a building that everyone else had decided was worthless, and she had found, on the 3rd floor, in a corner under a fallen beam, proof that nothing is ever truly worthless. Not buildings. Not people. Not old women sleeping in parking lots with $217 in their checking accounts. Eleanor Briggs closed her eyes. She slept better than she had slept in 6 weeks. In the morning, before Henry's truck appeared at the end of the gravel drive, she walked down to the creek again and washed her face in the cold water. She brushed her hair with her fingers. She put on the cleanest shirt she had in the Buick. She wanted to look like someone who could be trusted with what she was holding. She wanted to look like someone who deserved to be standing in this place. Henry's truck appeared at exactly 8:15 in the morning, trailing a small cloud of dust behind it. He pulled up close to the cottage and got out, and the bed of his truck was loaded with materials. Sheets of plywood, a box of nails, a bundle of cedar shingles, a roll of roofing felt, a ladder lashed to the side rails, 2 thermoses of coffee, a paper bag that, when he handed it to Eleanor, turned out to contain 2 ham sandwiches and 4 homemade biscuits wrapped in wax paper. "My wife made these," Henry said. "She wanted to come too, but I told her give us a day. Your wife knows. My wife knows I came over here yesterday and met the lady who bought the mill. She does not yet know about the chest. I didn't think that was mine to share." Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "For the sandwich? For not telling her about the chest yet." Henry nodded once. "I made 1 phone call last night. Just 1. To a fellow I know at the State Historical Commission. I didn't tell him what we had. I told him I had a question about how a person might handle a hypothetical historical discovery on private property. He told me to come see him whenever I wanted. He'll know what to do." "Henry, I don't have money for any of this. The plywood, the shingles. I don't have money to pay you." Henry was already unlashing the ladder from the truck. He paused and looked at her over the top of his cap. "Eleanor, you are sitting on a piece of property that my great-grandfather bought because he knew there was something here worth knowing. You are the first person in 150 years to find it. Do not insult me by talking about money." He went back to unlashing the ladder. They worked together all that morning. Henry climbed the ladder onto the cottage roof, and Eleanor stood below handing up shingles. She had never roofed a building in her life. She had taught 2nd grade. But Henry was patient and explained what he was doing as he did it. And after the first hour, Eleanor was handing up the right shingles in the right order, and they had gotten into a rhythm. The worst of the roof damage was at the back of the cottage, over what had been the bedroom. A section about 6 feet square where the original cedar shingles had rotted clean through. Henry tore off the bad section, laid down new felt, and started replacing the shingles row by row. Eleanor, on the ground, found herself watching his hands as he worked. They were old hands, knuckles thick from decades of farming, but they moved with the surety of a man who had done this work many times before. Each nail went in with 3 sure hits of the hammer. Each shingle laid down at exactly the right overlap. Around noon, they stopped and ate the sandwiches Henry's wife had made. They sat on the porch steps and ate in silence for a while, because they had been working hard and were tired and hungry, and there was no need to fill the air with talking. When they finished, Henry pulled out the thermos of coffee and poured 2 cups into the small tin mugs he'd brought. "Eleanor," he said, "can I ask you something?" "All right. You have a son?" "I have a son. Where is he? Eleanor looked down at her coffee. He lives 3 hours north. He works in commercial real estate. He has a wife and 2 children. I have not seen him in 11 years. He told me last week that I am insane. Henry was quiet for a moment. My boy lives in Seattle, he said. Works at one of those big companies. I never can keep them straight. We see him twice a year if we're lucky. Christmas and once in the summer. He sends my wife flowers on Mother's Day. He calls me on my birthday and on Father's Day. He hasn't been back to the farmhouse in 3 years. He took a sip of coffee. It's not a thing that happens to 1 or 2 people, Eleanor. It's a thing that's happening to a lot of us. Our kids grew up and got busy and got far away, and we got old, and somehow they decided that being old meant we didn't need them anymore. Or maybe they decided it meant we were too much to deal with. I don't know which one. My husband used to say, Eleanor said, that we raised them to leave. That was the whole point. To raise them strong enough to leave. Your husband sounds like a smart man. He was. What did he do? He worked for the railroad. 41 years. Henry nodded slowly. My father worked for the railroad. The reading line. 26 years before he got hurt on the job, and they put him out. They sat together in the noon sun on the porch of a 175-year-old cottage drinking coffee from tin mugs, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since Walter had died, that she was sitting beside someone who understood the shape of her life. It was not a romantic feeling. Henry had a wife. Eleanor had a wedding ring on a chain around her neck and no intention of taking it off. It was something else. Something more like recognition. Like meeting another person who had read the same book. They went back to work. By the end of the day, they had patched the worst of the cottage roof, boarded up 3 broken windows, swept out the small bedroom, and dragged the rotted porch boards into a pile to be burned. Henry had also walked the mill itself with Eleanor, looking at the bigger problems with a contractor's eye. The mill itself is going to take serious money, he said as they walked back to the cottage. Serious money. We're talking tens of thousands. Maybe more, depending on what you want to do with it. The cottage we can make livable for not much. A few $100s in materials. The mill is a different animal. I don't have money for the mill. I know you don't. I have $217 in my checking account. Henry stopped walking. He looked at her. $217. $217. He looked at the mill. He looked at the cottage. He looked at her. Eleanor. The chest. I know. The chest is the answer to a lot of these questions. I know. Have you thought about what you want to do with it? Eleanor stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She looked at the building behind her, at the broken water wheel, at the creek beyond. I have been thinking about it since I opened it, she said. I keep going in circles. Part of me thinks I should just hand it over to a museum and walk away. Part of me thinks I should sell the coins and use the money to fix the mill and turn this place into something. Part of me thinks I should find the descendants of Samuel and Hannah Green first and ask them what they think should happen. That last one, Henry said. That last one. That last one is the right one. Eleanor looked at him. It's not our chest, Eleanor. Not yours, not mine, not Josiah Hadley's heirs. It belongs to the family that left it. If we can find them, that's where we start. Eleanor felt something settle into place inside her chest. All right, she said. Then that's where we start. They cleaned up their tools. Henry loaded the leftover materials back into his truck. He told Eleanor he'd come back the next morning with his wife, and his wife would bring more food, and they would start tackling the chimney and the kitchen pump and the front door, which had been hanging crooked on its hinges since Eleanor arrived. And I'll call my friend at the Historical Commission tomorrow, Henry said. I'll set up a meeting. We'll bring the ledger first. Not the chest. Just the ledger. We don't want to spook anyone yet. We want to find out what we have and who to talk to and how to do this right. Henry. Yeah. Thank you. Henry got into his truck. He paused with his hand on the door. Eleanor. Thank you for not just walking out of that hoist room with the coins in your pocket. A lot of people would have. He closed the door and started the truck. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him drive away, and the sky was turning purple at the edges, and a heron flew over the creek with its long wings moving slowly through the still air, and the second day at the mill came to an end. That night, Eleanor sat by candlelight at the table in the cottage, and she opened the ledger again, very carefully, and she read every entry in the back of the book. Every name, every date, every note in Josiah Hadley's careful spidery script. There were 47 people listed in those pages. 47 people who had passed through this mill on their way to freedom between 1862 and 1865. Eleanor wrote each name in her small notebook. She did not yet know what she would do with the list, but she knew she wanted to have it written down somewhere besides this fragile book. When she was done, she sat looking at the names for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and put it back in the chest. She closed the lid of the chest. She blew out the candle. She slept. On the morning of the third day, two things happened at almost the same time. The first thing was that Henry's truck pulled up the gravel drive at 7:45 in the morning, with Henry's wife Margaret in the passenger seat, holding a covered casserole dish and a thermos and a bag of what turned out to be fresh blueberry muffins. The second thing was that, less than an hour later, while Eleanor and Margaret were sitting on the porch eating muffins and getting acquainted, a black sedan turned off the paved road and started up the gravel drive toward the mill. Henry, who was up on the roof of the cottage finishing the work from the day before, called down, "Eleanor, we got company." Eleanor stood up. She watched the black sedan come up the drive. It was followed, about 30 seconds later, by a white news van with the logo of the regional television station on the side. And the news van was followed by two more cars Eleanor did not recognize, one a tan SUV and one a small blue hatchback. Henry came down the ladder. "Eleanor, did you call anyone?" "No. I called one person last night. After I left here. My friend at the Historical Commission. That's it. I called one person." "Henry, what is happening?" The black sedan pulled up close to the cottage and the door opened, and a man in his 50s got out. Gray suit, no tie. He had a folder under his arm. He looked at the cottage. He looked at the mill behind it. He looked at Eleanor. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Briggs?" "Yes. My name is David Carmichael. I'm the director of the County Historical Commission. I had a call from Henry Aldridge last night, who told me he had some questions for me, but didn't quite explain what they were about. I made some calls of my own this morning, and Mrs. Briggs, do you have any idea what you found?" Behind him, the news van was unloading a camera. The tan SUV had stopped at the edge of the property, and two people were getting out, a man and a woman, both holding cameras of their own, both with what looked like notepads. The blue hatchback parked behind the SUV, and a young woman got out, very young, maybe in her late 20s, carrying nothing but a small leather bag. The young woman from the hatchback walked straight past the news van and straight past the Historical Commission director and straight up to Eleanor on the porch. She stopped at the foot of the steps. Her hands were shaking. "Mrs. Briggs," she said, "my name is Imani Green. I drove down here from Philadelphia at 4 o'clock this morning. I got a phone call last night from a professor at the university who got a phone call from somebody at the State Historical Commission who said somebody had found." Her voice broke. She stopped. She put her hand over her mouth. She started again. "Mrs. Briggs, I'm the great-great-great-granddaughter of Samuel and Hannah Green. My family has been looking for what was lost for 4 generations, and someone told me last night that you might have found it." Eleanor stood on the porch of a watermill she had bought for $4,200 3 days earlier, and she looked at this young woman whose eyes were full of tears, and she understood that whatever she had thought was going to happen next, it was going to be bigger than that, and stranger than that, and more important than that, and she understood, in that moment, exactly what Henry's great-grandfather had felt when he had bought this place at auction in 1877 because he wanted to live somewhere that meant something. She walked down the porch steps slowly. She held out her hands to Imani Green. "Honey," she said, "you'd better come inside." Imani Green followed Eleanor up the porch steps with the careful uncertainty of someone walking into a dream they had been afraid to have. Margaret stood up from the porch step and quietly went around to the side of the cottage, giving them space. Henry came down the rest of the way off the ladder, set his hammer in his belt, and walked over to David Carmichael from the Historical Commission and said, "Hold everybody right here, just for a few minutes. Let them have this." Carmichael nodded once. He turned and walked back toward the news van and the two reporters, holding up his hand the way you stop traffic. Whatever he said to them, they listened. The cameras came down. The notepads got tucked under arms. Everybody stayed where they were on the gravel drive. Inside the cottage, Eleanor pulled out the second chair at the small wooden table where the chest still sat. She had placed an old cloth over it that morning, partly to protect it, and partly because she did not want to look at it every time she walked through the room until she knew what she was supposed to do. She lifted the cloth off. Imani Green sat down very slowly in the chair Eleanor had pulled out. She set her leather bag on the floor beside her. She did not reach for the chest. She just looked at it. The initials carved into the front of the lid were visible now, faintly, in the morning light coming through the boarded-up windows. J. H. Josiah Hadley, Imani said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You know the name? I have known that name since I was 9 years old. My grandmother kept a notebook her grandmother kept. Hannah Green's daughter. Her name was Ruth, and Ruth wrote everything she remembered her mother telling her, and she passed it down to her daughter, who passed it down to my grandmother, who passed it to my mother, who gave it to me when I started graduate school. It is a small notebook, Mrs. Briggs. About 50 pages of cramped handwriting. And on page 17 there is a paragraph that begins, We came to the mill of Josiah Hadley in the cold of March, and we left with him our wedding rings and our deeds and the picture of my parents, in trust, for he said the road north was dangerous and we should not carry what could not be replaced. Eleanor sat down across from her. She did not say anything. She let Imani look at the chest. After a while, Imani reached out one hand, very slowly, and touched the edge of the lid with 2 fingers. She did not open it. She just rested her fingertips on the wood for a long moment, the way a person might touch the headstone of someone they had loved and never met. Can I open it? Imani lifted the lid. She made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they have wanted for a very long time has appeared in front of them, and they have not yet decided whether to trust their own eyes. She looked at the ledger on top. She did not lift it out. Is the note still there? The one to Josiah? In the bottom of the chest, wrapped in waxed paper, behind a photograph. Imani lifted out the ledger and set it carefully on the table. She lifted out the cloth bag underneath. She lifted out the leather pouches one by one, and Eleanor could see her hands were shaking. But she was being careful, so careful, the way a person handles things that have survived more than they had any right to survive. She reached the bottom of the chest. She lifted out the small waxed paper package. She unwrapped it. She looked at the daguerreotype in its velvet case for what felt like a full minute. Then she opened the velvet case and looked at the photograph behind the glass. The man and the woman, both black, both dressed in fine clothing, both looking directly out of 1850-something at whoever was lucky enough to be holding their picture. Imani Green put the photograph down on the table. She put both her hands over her face. She cried for about 2 minutes without making much sound. Eleanor sat across from her and did not say anything. She had cried in this same spot 2 days earlier, and she knew there was nothing to say. She just sat there. When Imani took her hands down from her face, her eyes were red, but her expression was clearer than it had been when she walked in. She picked up the photograph again and looked at it. My great-great-great-grandparents, she said. There are no other pictures of them. There are no other pictures. My grandmother used to tell me she did not know what her own great-grandparents had looked like. She used to say it like it was a small wound she carried. She used to say, I don't know what my own people looked like, baby. I know their names and I know they were free and I know they were strong, but I don't know their faces. She set the photograph down again, very carefully. My grandmother died in 2009. She never saw this. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand on top of Imani's. She did not say anything. She did not have to. They sat that way for a while. Eventually, Imani picked up the note that had been tucked behind the daguerreotype. She read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she folded it back along the creases that had been pressed into it for 161 years and laid it down beside the photograph. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Eleanor, I have to ask you a question, and I need you to know that whatever you answer, I will not argue with you. This is your property. You bought it legally. Whatever is in this chest, by the laws of the state, belongs to you. I know what's in the chest is not mine. Imani looked at her. Honey, Eleanor said. I knew that 2 days ago when I opened the lid. I knew it before I knew what any of it was worth. I would not be human if I did not. The question is not whether it's yours or mine. The question is what we do with it now. Imani looked down at the table. She looked at the leather pouches. She looked at the ledger. The ledger, she said. The ledger has names. It has the names of 47 people who came through this mill. 47. I counted them last night. Some of them, Eleanor, some of them. Those families have been looking for 2 and 3 generations to know which station their people passed through. Some of those names are on family trees with question marks beside them. This ledger could close a lot of question marks. Eleanor nodded. Then the ledger belongs to a museum, she said. A real one. The kind that has historians who know how to make a digital copy and put the names where people can find them. Imani let out a long, slow breath. Yes. And the photograph belongs to you and to your family. Yes. And the coins and the deeds and the bonds and the pouches. Those were left in trust with Josiah Hadley by Samuel and Hannah Green. Their note says so. So those belong to their descendants. To you. And to whoever else in your family is still living. Imani was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, do you understand what's in these pouches? I understand they are old coins and old papers. I do not yet understand how much they are worth. I haven't appraised them. I won't, that's not my field. But Eleanor, I am a doctoral candidate in African American history. I have spent 8 years studying the Underground Railroad. I know enough about 19th century currency and Union bonds to tell you, just from glancing at what is in front of me. There is somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 worth of 19th century coinage in those pouches. Some of those gold pieces alone, if they are in the condition I think they are worth $4,000 each. And the uncut stones in the first pouch. I don't know what those are, Eleanor. I am not a gemologist. But they are not nothing. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs and come back in slowly. All right, she said. Eleanor. All right. That is your family's money. Imani looked at her for a long time. Eleanor, you bought this place for what? $4,200. And you have how much money in the world? $217 in checking. About $1,800 in savings I had to leave alone. That's everything. And you are sitting across from me telling me that something worth more than your house, more than your car, more than everything you have ever owned in your life, belongs to me. Not because the law says so, because you say so. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. Honey, I taught second grade for 28 years. I taught a lot of children to tell the truth about whose pencil was whose. I cannot, at 69 years old, sit here and pretend something belongs to me when I know it doesn't. I would not be able to sleep in this cottage. I would not be able to walk past that chest. The mill itself, the land, the cottage, that's a different story. I paid for that. I'm keeping that. But what's inside this chest was put there by somebody else for safekeeping. The note even says so. Until such day as it may serve another in need. Imani picked up the note again. She read those words once more. Until such day as it may serve another in need, she repeated. She looked up. Eleanor, you are in need. I have a roof over my head and a creek for water and a man helping me board up windows. I am not in need anymore. I was in need 3 days ago. I am not in need today. Eleanor. What? Imani's eyes were wet again. My family has had this conversation for 161 years. About what to do if any of it was ever found. Every generation has had it. My grandmother had it. My mother had it. I have had it with my brother and my aunt and my cousins. The conversation has always ended the same way. She paused. The conversation has always ended with, whoever finds it and is honorable enough to return it should be honored in return. That has been the family understanding. For 5 generations. Eleanor, we are not taking everything in this chest and leaving you with $217. Eleanor opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the ledger and the pouches and the photograph and the note. Let's not decide that today, she said. Let's get the chest appraised properly. Let's find your family. The rest of your family. Let's bring in the right people from the Historical Commission. And then, when we know what is what, the family decides what to do. Not me. The family. Imani wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. All right, she said. All right. The family decides. Eleanor nodded once. She got up. She walked to the door. She opened it. Outside, on the gravel drive, David Carmichael and the 2 reporters and the camera crew from the news van were all standing in a small patient cluster around Margaret Aldridge, who was apparently telling them a story about the time her grandfather had repaired the original water wheel in 1948. Henry was leaning on his truck with his arms crossed, watching them with the mild amusement of a man whose wife had clearly taken charge. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. Everybody turned. Mr. Carmichael, Eleanor said. Would you like to come in? Just you. Not the cameras. Not yet. David Carmichael came up the porch steps. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at the table. He saw the ledger. He saw the open chest. He saw the photograph propped against the side of it. He sat down hard in the chair Eleanor had vacated. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them on his shirt. He put them back on. He looked again. "Mrs. Briggs," he said quietly. "Mr. Carmichael. Mrs. Briggs. This is one of 3 confirmed stations in this county. We have known there were others. We have never been able to find documentary evidence. Until now." Until now. He reached out very carefully and laid one finger on the closed front cover of the ledger. He did not open it. "May I?" "Yes." He opened the ledger and read the first page. Then he turned to the back of the book the way Eleanor had done, the way Henry had done, the way Imani had done. He read the entries in the urgent, hurried handwriting. He sat back in the chair after a few minutes. "Mrs. Briggs, I have worked in this field for 31 years. I have never seen something this complete. Mr. Carmichael, this is Imani Green. She is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Samuel and Hannah Green. They are on page 204 of that ledger." David Carmichael turned to Imani. He took off his hat, which he had been holding in his lap. "Ms. Green," he said, "I am honored to meet you. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." The next 4 hours were a kind of controlled chaos that Eleanor would not have known how to manage on her own. David Carmichael, very quietly, sent the news van away. He told the 2 reporters they would get a story, but not today. He told them that if they pushed, they would get nothing. They left without arguing, because David Carmichael had 31 years of credibility in this county, and they knew not to cross him on something this serious. He stayed. He called a colleague at the state archives. He called a textile conservator who specialized in 19th century paper. He called a coin appraiser in the city, a woman named Dr. Lila Okafor, who had worked with the Historical Commission on 3 previous projects and who, when she heard what David had to say, told him she would be in her car within the hour. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the cottage was full of people who knew what they were doing. The conservator, a small woman in her 60s named Patricia Voss, photographed every page of the ledger before anyone was allowed to turn another page. She wore white cotton gloves. She handled the book like a newborn. Dr. Okafor arrived at 3, set up a small portable workstation on the porch, and began the slow, careful process of cataloging the contents of the leather pouches. Eleanor sat in the corner of the cottage and watched. Imani sat beside her. They did not say much. There was nothing to say. Around 4 o'clock, Dr. Okafor came in from the porch with a small notepad. She sat down at the table. "Mrs. Briggs, Ms. Green, I want to give you my preliminary assessment. This is not a final appraisal. I will need to take these to my lab, but I can tell you generally what we are looking at. Please." The first pouch contains 63 U.S. silver dollars dated between 1841 and 1859. Most are in very fine to extremely fine condition. The conservative auction value for the silver alone is between $45,000 and $50,000. The pouch also contains 19 gold pieces, mostly $5 half eagles and 3 $10 eagles. Conservative value, $90,000 to $110,000. She turned a page. The 3 stones in the first pouch are uncut diamonds. 2 are approximately 1 carat each. The third is approximately 3 carats. They will need to be evaluated by a gemologist. Conservative range, $15,000 to $30,000. She turned another page. The second pouch contains 41 additional coins, 3 pieces of jewelry including the gold locket Mrs. Briggs mentioned, and a small cloth bundle of what appeared to be Mexican silver pesos, which were widely circulated in the American South in the 1850s. Conservative value, $60,000 to $80,000. She paused. The third pouch contains documents. Among them are 11 U.S. Treasury bonds issued in 1862 and 1863, the so-called 520 bonds. 2 of them have never been redeemed. Mrs. Briggs, Ms. Green, this is unusual. Unredeemed federal bonds from that era retain their face value plus, in certain circumstances, accrued statutory interest, depending on a legal process. I am not a securities lawyer, but the face value of the 2 unredeemed bonds is $1,000 each. There is also a deed in that pouch for a parcel of land in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which would need to be researched for current ownership status. She set the notepad down. My preliminary total for the contents of this chest, not including the ledger and the photograph, which are historically priceless but not in the same category. My preliminary total, conservatively, $220,000. A more aggressive valuation, depending on auction market and the diamond appraisals, could approach $350,000. Nobody said anything for a moment. Dr. Okafor closed her notepad. That is what is in this chest, Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor stared at the cloth on the table. Imani reached over and took her hand. That is what is in this chest, Eleanor repeated. Yes. That belongs to her family, Eleanor said. All of it, except for the ledger. The ledger belongs to a museum. Dr. Okafor looked at Imani. Imani did not let go of Eleanor's hand. Mrs. Briggs is generous, Imani said. Mrs. Briggs is more generous than she should be. My family will be making decisions about all of this together. Mrs. Briggs is part of those decisions. Do you understand me, Dr. Okafor? Mrs. Briggs is part of those decisions. Dr. Okafor nodded once. Of course. She gathered her materials and went back out to the porch to finish documenting. David Carmichael drifted out behind her. Patricia Voss was already on the porch, photographing the chest itself from every angle. Eleanor and Imani were alone in the cottage. I told you I am not in need, Eleanor said quietly. And I told you what my family decided 5 generations ago. Eleanor, please, just let it be. Right now, let's just let it be. Eleanor nodded. She squeezed Imani's hand. She did not say anything else. The news broke on a Friday evening, 2 days later. David Carmichael had been very careful about how it broke. He had coordinated with Imani's family, who by then had spent 48 hours in conference calls with each other. The Green family had elders. They had a process. They had decided that the discovery would be announced jointly by the Historical Commission and by the family, that Eleanor Briggs would be named as the owner of the property and the person who had found the chest, and that the story would emphasize the partnership between Eleanor, Henry, the Commission, and the Green family, rather than the dollar value of the contents. That was the plan. The internet had other plans. By Saturday morning, a headline had appeared on a national news website that read, Widow buys condemned mill for $4,200, finds underground railroad treasure worth $250,000. The article was largely accurate. It included a quote from David Carmichael and a quote from Imani Green's uncle, who was the family spokesperson. It also included a photograph of Eleanor standing on the porch of the cottage with Henry Aldridge beside her and Margaret holding a tray of muffins. By Saturday afternoon, the story was on a dozen news websites. By Saturday evening, it was on national television. By Sunday morning, somebody had found Eleanor's phone number, which had been listed in the regional directory because she had never thought to remove it. The Buick had been moved up close to the cottage. The cellular signal at the mill was so poor that Eleanor's phone showed missed calls in batches when she walked down to the road, and the batches were in the dozens. She turned the phone off. Henry came over on Sunday afternoon with Margaret and a large box of groceries. Eleanor, he said, there are cars stopped at the end of the road. 3 of them when I came past. People with cameras. I know. I saw 2 of them walk down the drive this morning. Imani sent a man from the Historical Commission to ask them to leave. They left, but they came back. You want me to call the sheriff? Not yet. You sure? Henry, I bought this property fair and square. I have a right to be on it. If they come up the drive, they are trespassing, and the sheriff can handle them then. I don't want to look like a woman hiding behind the police. I just want to be left alone. Henry nodded. All right. Margaret put the groceries on the kitchen counter, which now had a refurbished hand pump that Henry had repaired the day before. She turned around and looked at Eleanor. Eleanor, has he called? Who? Your son. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He has not called. Margaret pressed her lips together. She did not say anything else. She just unpacked the groceries. Eleanor sat down at the table. The chest was no longer there. It had been moved, the previous day, to a secure storage facility at the State Archives, under joint custody of the Historical Commission and the Green family, pending the formal disposition of the contents. The ledger and the photograph were also there, in climate-controlled storage. Patricia Voss had taken them. She had cried when she had wrapped the ledger for transport. The table was bare. It looked strange. Eleanor had gotten used to the chest sitting in the middle of her cottage. The phone she had turned off was sitting on the table. It was, she realized, the only object on the table at all. She turned it on. She had 93 missed calls. She had 271 text messages. She had, by her count, perhaps 15 voicemails from numbers she recognized. People she had taught second grade with 30 years ago. a cousin she had not spoken to in 15 years. The pastor of the church she and Walter had gone to before he died, calling to congratulate her and to ask if she had thought about making a contribution. She scrolled through. She found, near the bottom, the name she had been both looking for and not looking for. Brian, cell. He had called 11 times in the last 2 days. He had also sent 3 text messages. The first one, sent Saturday morning, read, "Mom, call me. The story is everywhere." The second one, sent Saturday evening, read, "Mom, pick up the phone, please." The third one, sent Sunday morning at 7:02, read, "Mom, I am driving down today. I need to see you. Vanessa is coming too." Eleanor read the third message 3 times. She put the phone face down on the table. She walked outside. Henry was in the yard sharpening a hand scythe Margaret had brought along in the bed of the truck. The yard was getting trimmed back, slowly, an hour or 2 at a time. Margaret had said she was tired of looking at it overgrown and was going to fix it whether Eleanor wanted her to or not. Eleanor had learned in 2 days, a force of nature. Margaret looked up from where she was pulling honeysuckle off the porch railing. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Brian is coming." Margaret stopped working. Henry stopped sharpening. Today. He drove down from the city. He should be here in 2 hours, maybe less, depending on when he sent that message. Margaret straightened up. She brushed her hands off on her pants. "Eleanor, do you want us to stay or do you want us to go?" Eleanor thought about it. "Stay," she said. "I don't want to be alone. Stay for the part where he gets out of the car. After that, I think I need to talk to him by myself." "Okay." Henry set the scythe against the side of the cottage. He walked over to Eleanor and stood in front of her. "Eleanor." "Yeah. Whatever he came down here to say, whatever he came down here to do, you owe him nothing." "Henry, you don't owe him anything, Eleanor. I owe him the conversation." Henry studied her face. He nodded once. "All right, the conversation. But that is what you owe him. Nothing past the conversation." Eleanor put her hand on his arm for a moment. She did not say anything. She walked back into the cottage. She sat at the table. She waited. Brian's car came up the gravel drive at exactly 12:47 in the afternoon. It was a silver Lexus SUV, very clean, very new, the kind of car a man drives when he wants to be seen driving it. He parked it well back from the cottage and got out. Vanessa got out of the passenger side. Both of them were dressed as if they were going to a business meeting. Brian wore a button-down shirt and pressed pants. Vanessa wore a dark blouse and slacks and a string of pearls that Eleanor recognized, after a moment, as the pearls Vanessa had inherited from her own mother. Eleanor watched from the porch. Henry and Margaret stood a little behind her, on either side, the way people stand when they want you to know they are there, but are not interfering. Brian walked up the drive slowly. He stopped about 20 feet from the porch. He looked at the cottage. He looked at the mill behind the cottage. He looked at Henry and at Margaret, both of whom he did not know. He looked at Eleanor. "Mom." "Brian." He came closer. Vanessa came beside him. "Mom, we saw the story." "I gathered." "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" Eleanor folded her hands in front of her on the porch railing. "Brian, the last time we spoke, you called me insane and hung up the phone. I was not under the impression you wanted to be informed of my activities." His face went still. Vanessa stepped forward. "Eleanor, Brian was upset that day. He was worried about you. We were both worried about you. We didn't know how bad things had gotten. We didn't know about the apartment. We didn't know you were," she trailed off. She seemed to realize, as she was speaking, that what she had been about to say was living in a parking lot, and that there was no good way to say it. Eleanor finished it for her. "You didn't know I was sleeping in my car." Vanessa flinched. Brian did not look at her. He was looking at the cottage. He was looking at the way the boards on the porch had been swept clean, and the way the cedar shingles glowed on the new patch of roof, and the way the kitchen window now had real glass in it that Henry had brought from his own house, an old window from his barn that he had cut down to size. "Mom," he said quietly, "I had no idea things were like this." "You did not ask." "I know I did not ask. I am asking now. Mom, why did you not call me?" "Brian, I called you on the 8th of March. I told you I had a letter from the building owner increasing my rent. I told you I did not have the money. I told you I did not know what to do. You told me you had to go, because you had a thing that night, and you would call me on the weekend, and we would figure something out. You did not call me on the weekend. You did not call me on the next weekend. I called your office on the 20th of March and left a message with your assistant. You did not return the call. I called your house on the 22nd. Vanessa told me you were unavailable. By the time I left the apartment on the 28th, I had stopped expecting you to call. By the time I bought this property, I had stopped expecting anything. Brian's mouth opened. He closed it. Mom, I am not telling you this to hurt you, Brian. I am telling you this because you asked. You asked why I did not call you. The answer is that I did call you. Several times. You did not call me back. Brian looked at the porch boards. His face went very red. Vanessa was the one who spoke. Eleanor, I have to apologize. I did not give Brian those messages. I knew you had called. I told him you had called, but I did not tell him about the letter or the rent or the situation. I told him you wanted to chat. I did not realize. Her voice cracked. She gathered it. I did not realize you were in trouble. I should have told him. Eleanor looked at Vanessa. She thought about how easy it would be to be angry at this woman. This woman whose family had real money. This woman who had inherited pearls. This woman who had treated Eleanor for 23 years like a piece of furniture left over from someone else's life. She found, to her own slight surprise, that she could not muster the anger. It had been a long time since she had needed it. Vanessa, I am not angry at you. I am angry at myself for not being clearer. I should have said to my son, I need help and I need it now. I did not say that. I said something polite and vague, the way I have always said things. I am 69 years old, and I am still learning to ask for what I need. Brian sat down on the porch step. He put his face in his hands. Eleanor watched him for a moment. She did not go to him. She did not move. She had spent a lifetime going to him when he was upset. She had gone to him when he cried as a baby. She had gone to him when he fell off his bicycle at 7 and skinned his knee. She had gone to him at 15 when he had not gotten the part in the school play and had locked himself in his bedroom. She had gone to him at 22 when he had broken up with his college girlfriend and called her at 2 in the morning from a parking lot, crying. She had not been able to go to him for the last 11 years because he had not let her. She was not going to go to him now just because he had decided to feel something on her porch. She waited. After a while, he looked up. His eyes were wet. Mom, I have been the worst son in the world. You have not been the worst son in the world. You have been a son who got busy and got far away and forgot to call his mother. There are a lot of those. You are not special. He let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. That is the worst comfort I have ever received. It is not comfort, Brian. It is the truth, which is a different thing. Henry, behind Eleanor on the porch, shifted his weight slightly. Eleanor knew without looking that Henry was deciding whether to step in or step back. She held up one hand, the smallest gesture, just enough that he would see it. He stepped back. Eleanor came down off the porch. She did not go to Brian. She walked past him. She walked to the edge of the porch railing and stood looking at the mill across the small yard. She heard Brian get up behind her. She heard Vanessa take a small step. Brian, Eleanor said, come stand here. Look at this with me. Brian came and stood beside her. He looked at the mill. Mom, it was a wreck 3 days ago. It is still a wreck. There is a tree growing through the porch of this cottage. The roof of the mill is open to the sky in 3 places. The water wheel does not turn. The granary floor is rotted through in the back corner. Mom, and there is, on the 3rd floor, in the room where the hoist used to be, the place where I found a wooden chest that everyone in the world is now talking about. There is also a view, from the broken window in that room, of 3 acres of land that I own. I own it, Brian. Not the bank. Not a landlord. I own it. There is a creek. There is a meadow. There is a stand of oak trees older than this country. She turned to face him. This is the first property I have ever owned in my life. Your father and I rented every place we lived. The house on Linden Avenue was a mortgage that we did not pay off until you were in college. When your father died, the bank had to be paid before I could keep any of his pension. I sold the house to pay the medical bills and the debts your father did not know how to tell me about. The apartment above the dry cleaner was a rental. The Buick was used. The cast iron skillet I cook on was your grandmother's. I have owned almost nothing in my life that I did not also have to give back to somebody else. Mom, I did not know any of this. You did not ask, Brian. And I did not tell you because I did not want to be a burden. That was my mistake. Not yours. Mine. I was the one who decided to be quiet about my situation. So this part is on me. Brian's eyes were wet again. What can I do? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Brian, I am going to tell you what you can do. I am going to tell you, but I want you to think very carefully before you agree to anything. Because I am not the same person I was 3 weeks ago. I am not the same person who called you on the 8th of March. The woman who called you on the 8th of March was a woman who needed help. The woman standing in front of you right now does not need help. She needs something else. What? Eleanor took a breath. She needs a son, not a wallet, not a guest room, not a holiday card. A son. The kind that calls on a Tuesday because it is Tuesday. The kind that drives down without being summoned by a news story. The kind that knows the name of the woman who is helping his mother fix her roof. That is what I need, Brian. I do not need your money. The chest has solved my money problem. You read the news. You know that. I do not need your money. I need a son. Brian was quiet for a long time. Mom, I do not know how to be that. I am not sure I ever knew. Then you can learn. Or you can decide not to learn. That is up to you. But that is the only thing I need from you. And you do not have to decide today, and you do not have to promise me anything in the next 10 minutes. You can drive home and think about it. You can call me in a week, or 2 weeks, or a month. You can call me when you have decided. And until then, I do not need anything from you. Brian looked at the mill. He looked at the cottage. He looked, for the first time, at Henry and Margaret on the porch, really looked at them. Mom, can I meet your friends? Eleanor blinked. Yes, she said. You can meet my friends. She walked back to the porch. Henry stepped forward. Henry, Margaret, this is my son Brian and his wife Vanessa. Brian, Vanessa, this is Henry and Margaret Aldridge. They live 2 miles down the road. Henry's great-grandfather owned this mill from 1877 to 1889. Henry has been helping me fix the cottage. Henry stepped down off the porch and shook Brian's hand. Brian, pleased to meet you. Brian's hand was, Eleanor could see, slightly trembling. Mr. Aldridge. Henry, thank you for helping my mother. Henry looked at him for a long, steady moment. Your mother is the kind of woman who helps herself. I am just along for the work. Brian nodded. He swallowed. Margaret came down off the porch with a smile that was warm and not at all forced. You and your wife eaten? We have lunch in the truck. We brought enough for an army because that is what we always do. We have not eaten. Come around back. Eleanor has a beautiful spot by the creek. We will set up out there. Henry, bring the cooler. Margaret was, as Eleanor had observed before, a force of nature. Lunch happened. Brian and Vanessa sat on a folded blanket beside Hadley's run and ate sandwiches Margaret had made that morning. They drank lemonade from a thermos. Vanessa took her pearls off and put them in her purse without comment, the way a woman does when she realizes she has dressed for the wrong occasion. Henry told the story of his great-grandfather buying the mill in 1877, leaving out the part about the chest, which Brian and Vanessa did not yet know in full detail because the news stories had been general. Margaret talked about her grandmother, who had repaired the water wheel in 1948. Eleanor watched her son. She watched him listen. She watched him laugh. Once, at something Henry said about a goat his great-uncle had owned that had broken into the mill in 1932 and eaten an entire week's worth of flour. She watched him, near the end of lunch, turn to her and say, Mom, could I see inside the cottage? She nodded. She walked him inside, just the two of them. He looked at the wooden table where the chest had been. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the bedroom with its new ceiling. He stopped in the middle of the front room and stood there a long time. Mom, where's the chest? The State Archives. Joint custody with the Green family. It is being properly cataloged. The contents. Brian, the contents do not belong to me. He turned to look at her. Mom, the contents were left in trust with the original miller in 1864 by a family escaping to Canada. The note that was with them said they should be returned to whoever could use them in need. The Green family has known about that note for 5 generations. They want me to take part of the value. I have not yet decided what part, if any, I am willing to accept. The discussion is ongoing. Brian sat down at the table. Mom, the news story said it was worth $250,000. That is the conservative estimate, and you are not keeping it. I am not keeping what is not mine, Brian. That has been my answer to every other question in my life. Why would it change now? He looked at her. She could see, on his face, a kind of slow recognition, as if he were realizing that the mother he had assumed he knew, the mother he had filed away as a sweet old woman who needed to be managed, had always been somebody else, somebody more complicated, somebody he had never quite bothered to know. Mom. Yes. Can I help? With the mill. With the fixing of it. With whatever needs to be done. Not money. Or not just money. I mean, can I drive down on weekends? Can I bring the kids? Can Tyler come down for a week this summer when he is off work? Can I? Eleanor sat down across from him. She looked at her son. Brian. Yes. You can do all of that. He put his hand on the table. She put hers on top of his. They sat like that for a while. Outside, Henry and Margaret and Vanessa were sitting by the creek. Eleanor could hear them talking. She could hear Vanessa laugh at something. It was a sound Eleanor had not heard in 23 years. After a while, Brian said, Mom, can I tell you something? Yes. I have been having a hard time at work. For about 2 years now. I have not told you. I have not told Vanessa, really. The development project I was on collapsed in November. The company let go of a lot of people. I kept my job, but I lost most of my commission structure. I have been working twice as hard for half the money. The reason I did not call you back in March was that I was on a call with a lawyer about whether to file for personal bankruptcy, and I did not have anywhere to put your problem on top of mine. So I shut the door. He looked down at the table. It does not excuse it. I know it does not excuse it. I should have told you. I should have called you the next day. I should have, at the very least, told Vanessa to tell me when you called. I should have done 100 things differently. I am telling you now because you deserve to know I was not just busy. I was drowning, and drowning made me a coward. Eleanor looked at her son. She felt, in her chest, 100 things at once. Some of them sharp, some of them old, some of them brand new. She squeezed his hand. Brian, we are going to talk about this. Not today. Today is a lot. But we are going to talk about this. You are going to come back next weekend. You are going to bring Vanessa and the kids if they want to come. And we are going to sit on that porch and we are going to talk about what is happening in your life. And I am going to listen. And then we are going to figure out, together, what comes next. For both of us. All right. He nodded. All right. And Brian. Yes. For what it's worth. The mother who called you on the 8th of March would have given you everything she had to help you out of a hard time. Even when she had nothing. I want you to remember that. The next time you decide whether to pick up the phone. He started to cry then. He cried quietly, the way men of his generation cry, with his shoulders shaking and his hand over his eyes. Eleanor sat with him. She did not say anything else. She had said what she needed to say. That evening, after Brian and Vanessa had driven back to the city, after Henry and Margaret had gone home for the night, after the cottage had become quiet again with the kind of quiet that comes after a long day, Eleanor sat on the porch step alone and watched the light fade over the creek. A great blue heron came in low over the water and landed at the bend below the mill. It stood very still, watching for fish. Eleanor watched the heron. She thought about Brian. She thought about Imani Green, who had called twice that afternoon to check on her, and who had told her the family was flying down on Friday to formally accept custody of the chest's contents and to meet Eleanor properly. She thought about Samuel and Hannah Green, whose photograph was now in a climate-controlled vault 3 counties away, but whose faces she could still see clearly when she closed her eyes. She thought about Josiah Hadley, who had kept this secret for so long that the building itself had almost forgotten it. She thought about Henry's great-grandfather, who had bought this mill because he knew, somehow, that there was something here worth knowing. She thought about Walter. She thought about Walter for a long time. She had not, she realized, talked to Walter much in the last 6 weeks. The parking lots and the panic had pushed him a little out of her mind, which was the strangest thing, because for 11 years he had been the one constant in her thoughts. The grief had been her shape, and then for 6 weeks the grief had to share space with something else, and she had not noticed that the grief had quieted. It was quiet now. It was not gone. She did not think it would ever be gone, but it was quiet, in the way a river is quiet between rapids, still moving, still going somewhere, but not loud. Walter, she said to the porch boards, I bought a mill. I think you would have liked it. The heron at the bend in the creek shifted slightly. It speared something out of the water with its long beak and tipped its head back and swallowed. Eleanor smiled. She went inside. She lit the candle on the table where the chest had been. She made herself a cup of tea on the camp stove. She sat down at the table. She opened the small notebook where she had written the list of names from the ledger. 47 names. She read them slowly, one at a time, the way a person reads a prayer. Samuel and Hannah Green. Mary and Joseph Pinchback. The Cole family of 7. Cassius Webb traveling alone. Lucinda and her infant daughter Anne. She read every name. She closed the notebook. She blew out the candle. She lay down on her sleeping bag near the fireplace, which Henry had cleaned the day before so that Eleanor would be able to use it when the weather got cold. She closed her eyes. The sound of the creek came in through the open window of the bedroom, and the sound of the frogs along the bank, and somewhere far off the whippoorwill started up again. Eleanor Briggs slept the sleep of a woman who had, against all reasonable expectation, found her way home. She did not yet know about the lawyer who would call in 3 days from a firm in Philadelphia, asking on behalf of an anonymous donor whether Eleanor Briggs would be interested in discussing the historical preservation of the mill itself. She did not yet know about the letter that would arrive from the descendants of Cassius Webb, who had found her address through Imani Green's family and who wanted, very simply, to thank her. She did not yet know that the Green family, meeting in Philadelphia that same evening, had already decided, unanimously, what they wanted to do with their share of the contents of the chest, and that their decision would change Eleanor's life again, in ways she could not yet imagine. She did not yet know any of those things. She just slept, with the candle gone and the creek running outside and the bones of the old mill standing solid against the night. And in the morning, she would wake up, and the next chapter would begin. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after Brian and Vanessa had driven back to the city. Eleanor was on the porch with Margaret, snapping the ends off a basket of green beans Margaret had brought from her garden. The honeysuckle had been mostly cleared off the railing. The yard, slowly, was starting to look like a yard again. The maple tree growing through the porch boards had been cut down 2 days earlier by Henry and a man from Henry's church, a quiet retired carpenter named Pete, who had shown up unannounced with a chainsaw and a thermos of coffee and a story about how his uncle had hauled grain to this mill in 1968. Eleanor's phone rang. She picked it up off the porch railing. The number was a Philadelphia area code she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She had been letting most calls go to voicemail for a week. But something made her answer. Hello. Mrs. Briggs. Yes. Mrs. Briggs, my name is Adrian Caldwell. I am an attorney with the firm of Caldwell, Mason, and Tate in Philadelphia. I am calling on behalf of a client who has asked to remain anonymous for the moment. My client has read about the recovery of the Hadley Mill ledger and the Green family artifacts, and my client would like to know whether you would be willing to discuss the long-term preservation of the mill itself. Eleanor set the bowl of green beans down in her lap. I'm listening. My client wishes to make a substantial donation toward the restoration of the mill, on the condition that the property be placed into a preservation trust that would protect it permanently from development, while allowing you, Mrs. Briggs, to remain as the resident and primary steward of the property for as long as you wish to do so. How substantial? My client has authorized me to discuss a figure in the range of $400,000 to be administered through a foundation that would also fund a part-time salary for you, Mrs. Briggs, as the caretaker. The total package, over time, could be considerably more than that, depending on how the trust is structured. Eleanor was silent for a moment. Margaret, beside her, had stopped snapping beans. She was watching Eleanor's face. Ms. Caldwell. Yes. I do not understand what you are telling me. I understand. Let me put it differently. My client wants to ensure the mill is restored, maintained, and made available to the public as an educational and historical site, with you living there and serving as the keeper of the building. My client does not want the mill sold or developed. My client does not want to own the mill. My client wants it to remain yours, with a structure around it that ensures it will be cared for after you are gone. And your client wishes to remain anonymous. For the moment, yes. Ms. Caldwell, may I ask why? There was a small pause on the line. Mrs. Briggs, I am not authorized to disclose my client's identity. I am authorized to tell you this. My client read the news. My client read the names in the published portion of the ledger. My client is connected, by family, to one of those names. My client does not wish to make the discovery about herself. She wishes it to remain about you, and about the mill, and about the Green family. She has asked me to make that very clear. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. Ms. Caldwell, I would like to discuss this further, but I cannot make any decision without consulting with the Green family and with the Historical Commission. I am no longer comfortable making decisions about this property alone. My client expected nothing less. May I send you a written summary of the proposal that you can share with your advisors? Yes. To what address? Eleanor gave her the post office box in town that she had set up the previous week because the cottage had no mailing address recognized by the Postal Service. Mrs. Briggs. Yes. My client also asked me to convey one personal message. She asked me to tell you. The message is, thank you for not keeping what was not yours. My grandmother's name was on that ledger. She made it to Canada in 1864. She lived to be 91 years old. I am here because of what you did, even though what you did was 161 years before I was born. Eleanor sat very still. She did not speak for a long moment. Ms. Caldwell, please tell your client. Please tell her I will do my best to be worthy of what she is offering. I will tell her. The call ended. Eleanor set the phone down on the porch railing. Margaret looked at her. Eleanor. What? A woman in Philadelphia, whose grandmother is in the ledger. She is offering $400,000 to restore the mill, to set up a trust, to pay me a salary to live here and take care of it. Margaret put her bowl of beans down very carefully on the porch boards. Eleanor. I know. Eleanor. I know, Margaret. Margaret stood up. She walked to the porch railing and put both her hands on it and looked out at the mill. Eleanor, you realize what this is? What? This is the mill being saved. Not just the cottage. The mill. You are going to have a working watermill on this property again. Eleanor stood up beside her. She looked at the mill. She had been looking at it for almost 2 weeks now. She had grown used to its broken silhouette, the caved-in section of roof, the crooked water wheel, the empty windows on the second floor. She had stopped seeing it as ruined. She had started seeing it as hers. She tried, now, to see it the way Margaret was seeing it. With a new roof, with the water wheel turning, with visitors, with schoolchildren coming on field trips to learn about the Underground Railroad, with Imani's family driving down on summer weekends. She found that she could see it. She found that she had been seeing it that way, in small flickers, for days, without quite admitting it to herself. She blinked. Margaret, I have to call Imani. Yes. I have to call her right now. Yes, you do. Eleanor walked down the gravel drive to the spot near the paved road where the cell signal was reliable. She called Imani. Imani listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, Imani said, Eleanor, I have something to tell you too. We were going to wait until Friday when we drove down, but this is a good moment for it. The family met last night. We have made our decision. Tell me, the family is going to do the same thing your anonymous donor is doing, but in a different way. We are going to put the value of the contents into a foundation, the Green Hadley Foundation. We are going to name it after both families because both families made this possible. The foundation will fund Underground Railroad research, family reunification work for families looking for their stations, and educational programming about the network. Eleanor, we are going to base it at the mill. The foundation's first program will be hosted at the mill. Our first event will be a memorial for the 47 names in the ledger. Eleanor leaned against the gatepost. And Eleanor, the family voted unanimously. We are setting aside 30% of the value of the contents for you personally. We are not arguing with you about this. We are not going to be talked out of it. 30% in a separate trust, with income paid out to you for the rest of your life, and the principal going to a charity of your choosing after you pass. That is the family's decision. Eleanor, if you fight us on this, you are going to lose. Eleanor laughed. It was a small surprised laugh that came out of her before she knew she was going to make it. Imani, Eleanor, I am not going to fight you. Good. I had a speech prepared. I was going to argue. I was going to be very firm. I know you were. I am not going to give that speech. I am very glad. Eleanor stood on the gravel drive with her phone pressed to her ear and the May sun on her shoulders. A pair of swallows looped over the meadow on the far side of the creek, catching insects in the warm air. Imani, yes. The mill is going to live. The mill is going to live, Eleanor. And the names are going to be remembered. The names are going to be remembered. Eleanor closed her eyes. She had not, until that moment, fully understood that this was what she had been afraid of, that the mill would be saved and the chest would be returned and the names would be archived, and then it would all end. The story would close. The reporters would leave. The kindness would fade. And Eleanor would still be 69 years old, alone on 3 acres, with a building too big for her and a project too large to finish. She had not understood that she had been afraid of that until Imani told her it was not going to happen. Imani. Yes. I have to go sit down for a minute. Go sit down, Eleanor. I will call you tonight. The letter from the Webb family arrived on Thursday. It came to the post office box in town. Eleanor drove the Buick into town to pick it up, the way she had been doing twice a week to manage the mail that had started arriving from people who had read the news. The mail had been heavy. Eleanor had developed a system. Letters from strangers offering money went into one stack. Letters from strangers offering advice went into another. Letters from historical societies and universities went into a third. Letters from people who had read about the ledger and wondered if a name they were looking for might be in it went into a fourth, the most important stack, the stack she answered first. The Webb letter was different. It came in an envelope addressed in a tight, elegant handwriting that looked like the handwriting of a person who had been taught penmanship in a school that took penmanship seriously. Inside was a single folded sheet of cream paper, and on the paper, in the same handwriting, was a short note. Dear Mrs. Briggs, my name is Beatrice Webb Daniels. I am 84 years old. I am the great-great-granddaughter of Cassius Webb, who I am told appears in the ledger you discovered. My family has known he passed through Pennsylvania on his way to Canada in 1864. We have never known where. We have spent 4 generations not knowing where. Ms. Green called me last week. She told me about the ledger. She read me the entry. April 18th, 1864. Cassius Webb, alone, age uncertain, perhaps 22. Wounded in the hand from a gunshot, recovering. Stayed 5 nights. Quiet, brave. Sent on with the Quaker driver. May God watch over him. Mrs. Briggs. My great-great-grandfather lived to be 79 years old. He had 11 children. He had 37 grandchildren. He had more great-grandchildren than I can count. He died in 1921 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, holding the hand of his oldest daughter, who was my grandmother. My grandmother lived to be 93. She used to tell me, when I was a girl, that her father had a scar on the back of his left hand that he would touch sometimes when he was thinking about something. He never told her where it came from. I know where it came from now. Thank you, Mrs. Briggs. Thank you for opening that chest. Thank you for not keeping what was not yours. Thank you for letting me know, after 84 years on this earth, where my great-great-grandfather slept while his hand healed. I would like to visit the mill, if you would have me. I am too old to drive. My grandson has offered to bring me down. We will come whenever it is convenient for you. With my deepest gratitude, Beatrice Webb Daniels. Eleanor stood in the post office of the small town that had laughed at her 2 weeks earlier, and she read the letter 3 times. The young woman behind the counter, who had been the one to tell her there was a stack of mail waiting, watched her quietly. When Eleanor folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, the young woman cleared her throat. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor looked up. Mrs. Briggs. My mother. My mother was at the auction. The day you bought the property. Eleanor went still. My mother is the one who said bless her heart. She doesn't know what she just bought. She told me about it the next day at breakfast. She told me to remember it as a funny story. Eleanor did not say anything. Mrs. Briggs. My mother asked me to tell you, when you came in next, that she was wrong. She did not know how to call you to say it. She does not want to bother you. But she asked me to tell you, when I saw you. So I am telling you now. Eleanor looked at the young woman. The young woman was perhaps 25 years old. She had a name tag pinned to her shirt that read Karen. Karen. Yes, ma'am. What is your mother's name? Donna. Donna Pritchett. You tell your mother. You tell her I appreciate her sending the message. You tell her there is no need for her to feel bad about what she said. She said what most people in that room were thinking. She just happened to say it out loud. You tell her that if she ever wants to drive out to the mill, she is welcome. The door is open. The young woman's eyes filled up with tears. Mrs. Briggs. Thank you. I will tell her. Eleanor walked out of the post office with the letter from Beatrice Webb Daniels held very carefully in her hand. The sun on the sidewalk was warm. A woman pushing a stroller across the street saw her and stopped and waved. Eleanor did not know the woman, but the woman seemed to know her. Eleanor waved back. A man coming out of the hardware store across the street saw her and lifted his cap. She crossed the street to the hardware store because she needed nails for a porch railing repair Henry was planning to do that weekend. The man behind the counter at the hardware store was the owner, a man named Walt Pemberton, who had run the store for 30 years and who had been at the auction 2 weeks earlier. He had not bid on the mill, but he had been one of the people in the room who had laughed. He looked at Eleanor when she walked in. She walked up to the counter. "Walt, I need a pound of 4-penny finishing nails and 4 feet of 2x4 cedar. Whatever you have in your scrap pile is fine." He did not move. "Mrs. Briggs." "Yes, Walt." "Mrs. Briggs, I owe you an apology." Eleanor looked at him. She had known him for 30 years. She had bought Christmas lights from him every December. He had given her a small discount once on a furnace filter when she mentioned Walter was sick. He had come to Walter's funeral. He had hugged her at the funeral. He had also laughed at the auction. "Walt, you do not owe me an apology." I do. Mrs. Briggs, I sat in that room and I laughed at you. I sat in that room and I thought, that poor woman, she has lost her mind. And I told 3 different people at this counter the next morning about how you had bought a worthless mill for $4,200, and I shook my head about it the way a man does when he is happy. He is not the one making the mistake. He swallowed. "Mrs. Briggs, I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks now. I have been thinking about it because I cannot stop thinking about it. About how easy it was for me to laugh. About how I have lived in this town for 61 years and how I have laughed at a lot of people, mostly small laughs, mostly the kind you do not remember the next day. But how it must have felt to be on the other side of it. I do not know how it felt for you. I am sorry I never tried to know." Eleanor stood at the counter and watched this old man, who she had known for 30 years, who had been at her husband's funeral, who had laughed at her at the auction, struggle through the apology of his life. She did not interrupt him. She let him finish. When he was done, she said, "Walt, I appreciate that. I do. Now I need a pound of 4-penny finishing nails, please, and 4 feet of cedar from the scrap pile. We can talk about the rest another time. There is a lot to do at the mill." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. A small smile. A real one. "Yes, ma'am." He brought out the nails. He went to the back of the store and came back with a 4-foot length of cedar that was almost a 6-foot length, and he charged her for 2 feet of it. "Walt, Mrs. Briggs, that is more than 4 feet. It is what I had handy." "Walt, Mrs. Briggs." She paid him for the 2 feet. She walked out with cedar that was almost 6 feet long and a pound of finishing nails and the letter from Beatrice Webb Daniels in her purse and a slightly different feeling in her chest than she had walked in with. It was not vindication, exactly. She had not, at any point in the last 2 weeks, wanted vindication. The word had felt too small for what was happening, but it was something close to it. It was, maybe, the feeling of being seen properly for the first time by people who had not been able to see her properly before. That feeling, she found, was not as satisfying as she had expected it to be when she was younger and used to imagine such feelings. It was quieter. It was less triumphant. It was more like the feeling you get when a clock you have been listening to for a long time finally stops ticking, and you realize, in the silence, how loud it had been all along. The Green family arrived on Friday afternoon. They came in 3 cars. Imani drove the lead car with her uncle Marcus in the passenger seat, the man who had been the family spokesperson in the press. The second car carried Marcus's wife and their 2 adult children and a teenage grandson, who was Marcus's grandson. The third car carried Imani's mother and her aunt and a cousin Eleanor had not yet met named Theodore Green, who was, Imani had told Eleanor on the phone, the family genealogist and the one who had been working for 15 years on the family tree. They parked along the gravel drive. Eleanor was on the porch. She had baked, with Margaret's help, an enormous casserole of macaroni and cheese and a sheet pan of cornbread and 2 pies from blackberries Margaret had picked the day before from the bushes along the creek. Margaret had also brought a ham. Henry had set up a long folding table on the level patch of grass near the cottage. There were enough chairs for everyone. Eleanor walked down off the porch as they got out of the cars. Imani came up to her first and hugged her. It was a long hug. Eleanor had not been hugged like that in 11 years. She did not pull away. Then Imani stepped back, took Eleanor by the hand, and walked her down the line of family members. Marcus shook her hand and pulled her into a hug of his own. Marcus's wife kissed her cheek. The adult children, both of them in their 30s, looked at her the way you look at someone you have heard a great deal about, but did not expect to be exactly what you had imagined. The teenage grandson, a young man named Jamal who Eleanor would later learn was 16, shook her hand with a grave, formal expression and said, "Mrs. Briggs, it is an honor." Imani's mother was a small woman with very white hair and very clear eyes. She was perhaps Eleanor's age, maybe a little older. She held Eleanor's hand for a long time and did not let go. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Please. Eleanor. My mother, Imani's grandmother. She carried the story of that chest for 60 years. She carried it through her hardest days and her best days. She believed the chest was still somewhere. She told me, before she died, I will not live to see it found, but someone will find it, and when they do, they will know what to do. The old woman pressed Eleanor's hand. Eleanor, you knew what to do. Eleanor's eyes filled up. She did not trust her voice. The old woman patted her hand and let her go. Theodore Green, the genealogist, was a tall man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a leather satchel over his shoulder. He shook Eleanor's hand and said, Mrs. Briggs, I have brought charts. Eleanor laughed. It was a real laugh. Then you'd better come in, Mr. Green. The afternoon went the way good afternoons go. They ate at the long table. Henry told the story of the mill and his great-grandfather. Margaret told stories on Henry that made Henry roll his eyes. Imani's mother told a story about Hannah Green that had been passed down through 5 generations, about how Hannah, after she reached Halifax, had taught herself to read in a Quaker school by the time she was 32. Theodore brought out his charts after the pie and unrolled them on the table and showed Eleanor the family tree of Samuel and Hannah Green. It went down to Imani at the bottom of one branch and to Theodore's own granddaughter at the bottom of another, and it was a tree, an actual tree, with more than 240 names on it that Theodore had documented and verified over 15 years of work. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Eleanor. There are 47 names in the ledger you found. I have been in contact, since the news broke, with researchers and family historians who specialize in this kind of work. We have been comparing notes. As of this morning, we have positively identified the descendants of 19 of those 47 names. We have probable matches for another 11. We are still working. But Eleanor, already, we are talking to families in 7 states and 3 Canadian provinces. He pushed his glasses down onto his nose. Eleanor, you did not just find a chest. You started a reunion. Eleanor looked at the chart on the table. She looked at the names. 240 Greens, branching down through 5 generations from a man and a woman who had, in March of 1864, been hunted property of a Carolina plantation owner. She looked at the chart for a long time. She said, very quietly, Mr. Green, I want to ask you a question, and I do not want you to be polite about your answer. All right. Do you think Samuel and Hannah Green, if they could see this porch right now, would understand what is happening? Theodore Green was quiet for a moment. He looked at his mother, who was sitting at the end of the table eating a second slice of pie. He looked at his sister. He looked at Imani. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor, my great-great-great-grandfather went up to Canada with a wound in his side and his wife pregnant beside him and 2 children clinging to his coat. Everything he had ever owned was on his back. He left his wedding ring in this mill because he was afraid he would lose it on the road. He hoped to come back for it someday. He never did. He died in 1903 without ever seeing it again. My great-great-great-grandmother died 8 years later. They both died wondering if any of their family in the South was still alive. They never knew. They had to start over with nothing. He paused. Eleanor, if they could see this porch right now, they would understand what is happening. Because what is happening is, after 161 years, a piece of what they had to leave behind has come back to their family. That is what is happening. They would understand it perfectly, and they would understand who made it possible. He looked at her. That is the answer to your question. Eleanor sat very still. After a moment, she got up. She walked into the cottage. She came back out with the small notebook in which she had copied the 47 names from the ledger. She handed it to Theodore. Mr. Green, I copied these out of the ledger the second night I was here. Before I knew what I was going to do. Before I knew what any of this would become. I copied them because I wanted to have them written down somewhere besides that book. In case anything happened to the book, I would like you to have this notebook. Take it back to Philadelphia. Use it in your work. It is the working list. It is yours now. Theodore looked at the notebook. He held it in both hands for a moment. Eleanor, thank you. He put it in his satchel. After the meal, after the dishes had been carried inside, after the long table had been wiped down, Imani took Eleanor by the arm and walked her down to the creek. They stood at the edge of the water near the broken water wheel. The afternoon was beginning to soften into evening. The light on the creek was the color of weak tea. Eleanor. Imani. I need to tell you something privately. All right. The anonymous donor. The one with the lawyer. The $400,000 offer. I know who she is. I have known since the day after the news broke. I did not tell you because she asked me not to. Eleanor turned to look at Imani. All right. She is a woman in Philadelphia. She is 62 years old. She is a retired surgeon. She is also my second cousin once removed. She is on my family tree, Eleanor. Her grandmother is one of the 47 names. Her grandmother went up to Canada in 1864 with her husband and her infant. The infant grew up and became a teacher in Toronto. The teacher's daughter married a black doctor in Detroit in the 1930s. Their son was a professor at Howard. His daughter is the woman who is making the offer. She is your anonymous donor, Eleanor. She is family. Eleanor put her hand on the railing of the broken water wheel for balance. She did not want to come down with us today because she did not want her donation to be about her. She wanted it to be about the mill. She is going to come down in 2 weeks, privately, just to meet you. Then, after that, we are going to announce her involvement publicly because she wants the foundation to be known to be a multi-family project. The Green Hadley Foundation is going to have her family in it too. The Penningtons. That is her family name. Eleanor stared at the water. Imani. There are no coincidences in this story. No, there are not. Everything is connected to everything. It is. My husband used to say there are no coincidences. He said there is just the slow, patient work of God, who is too busy to introduce all his children to each other. So he leaves clues, and he hopes we will follow them. Imani smiled. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. He was a quiet man, but he was wise. They stood at the water for a long time. The heron came again, the same heron, the one that had been coming every evening for 2 weeks. It landed at the bend in the creek and stood very still. Eleanor watched it. Imani. Yes. I am going to live the rest of my life on this property. Yes, you are. I am going to be buried somewhere on this property, near my husband's grave if I can arrange it. I am going to ask my son to look into transferring his remains. He is buried in a public cemetery in a city we did not love. He should be here, with the bones of this mill, where the work is. Imani took her hand. Eleanor, the foundation will help with that. If your son agrees, we will help with all of it. All right, all right. The heron, at the bend in the creek, lifted off the water with a slow, heavy beat of its wings and flew away into the trees on the far side. The man in the polo shirt came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of June. Eleanor was outside, working with Henry on the new front fence. They had been at it for 3 days. The old fence had collapsed in places where deer had pushed through it over the years, and Henry had brought enough split-rail cedar from his own woodlot to redo the whole thing. Eleanor was holding rails in place while Henry drove the pins. The work was slow and steady and pleasant. A maroon pickup truck came up the gravel drive. Not a luxury vehicle. A working truck, perhaps 10 years old, well-maintained. The man who got out was the man from the auction. The man in the polo shirt who had bid against her up to $4,000 and then put down his paddle and smiled. Eleanor straightened up. Henry looked at her. You know him. I know him. The man walked up slowly. He had a cardboard box in his hands. He stopped about 10 feet from where Eleanor and Henry were working. Mrs. Briggs. Yes. My name is Daniel Wexler. I was at the auction in April. I bid against you on this property. I want you to know I am not here to bother you. I am here to give you something and to tell you a story I should have told you that morning, and then I will go. Eleanor set down the rail she had been holding. She brushed her hands off on her pants. Mr. Wexler. Henry, would you give us a few minutes? Henry nodded. He walked back toward the cottage with his hammer, leaving them alone by the fence. Daniel Wexler set the cardboard box on the top rail of the new fence. He did not open it. Mrs. Briggs. The morning of the auction. I came to that auction the way I come to every auction. I am a local developer. I have been building houses in this county for 31 years. I came to that auction looking for any piece of land that might be undervalued. I had no specific interest in this property. I had not, before that morning, even known the mill was up for sale. He paused. When I saw you bid against me, I looked you up on my phone. I have a paid service. I can search property records and tax records and news mentions from my phone in less than a minute. I looked you up, Mrs. Briggs, and I saw what your situation looked like. I saw that you had lived in a rental for 11 years. I saw that your husband had died and you had sold the house on Linden Avenue. I saw that there was a small civil filing from a building owner about an unpaid rent increase that had been filed only a few days before the auction. I saw who you were. He looked at the cottage. I knew, in that moment, that I was bidding against a woman who needed land more than I did. I put down my paddle. I want you to know that this was not generosity. I want you to know it was the smallest possible decency I could have offered. I could have raised my paddle and bought this property for less than $5,000. I could have bulldozed the mill. I could have subdivided the 3 acres. The cottage probably would have sat empty until it collapsed. I could have done all of that. Instead, I put down my paddle. I went home that night and told my wife about you, and she said, "Daniel, you did a small good thing today. Hold on to it." And I tried to hold on to it. But I did not hold on to it the way I should have. He took a breath. "Mrs. Briggs." I laughed with the rest of the room when they laughed at you. I did not laugh out loud, but I smiled. I shook my head. I let myself feel a little superior. I let myself think. I let her have it because it does not matter. She bought a worthless mill. I want you to know I felt that way for 2 weeks. Until the news broke. And then I felt sick. He set his hands on the top rail of the fence. "Mrs. Briggs, I did not come here to apologize for letting you have the property. I came here to apologize for laughing. I came here to apologize for the smallness of the goodness I offered. I should have offered more. I should have walked up to you that morning at the auction and asked if you needed help. I am a man with resources. I could have helped. I did not. I let you walk out of that room with a deed and $4,200 less in your bank account and nowhere to sleep that night. I should have done better." Eleanor looked at him. She thought, for a moment, about how to respond. She thought about her speech at the dedication, which had not yet happened but which she had already begun to think about in pieces. She thought about how easy it would be to be gracious. She thought about how easy it would be to be cold. She chose neither. "Mr. Wexler, I am going to tell you something, and I would like you to hear it. You did help that morning. You put down your paddle. That was real. It was not enough. You are right. It was not enough, but it was real, and I am alive today partly because of it. I would not be standing here today if you had bought this property. The chest would still be in the hoist room. The Green family would still be looking. 47 names would still be lost. The mill would have come down within 5 years. You put down your paddle, and a chain of things began. So when you say it was the smallest possible decency, you are right. But the smallest possible decency, in the right moment, is sometimes the difference between everything and nothing. I will not pretend otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Please. Eleanor. May I open the box?" "Yes." He opened the cardboard box. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, were 6 small framed photographs. He lifted the top one out. It was a black and white photograph of the mill, taken from across the creek. The water wheel was intact and turning. There were people on the porch of the cottage, dressed in clothing from the 1940s. "My grandfather took this in 1947, Daniel Wexler said. "My grandfather was a photographer. He took photographs of every mill in this county between 1945 and 1962, before they all closed. I inherited his archive when I was 30. I have 6 photographs of this mill. I want to give them to you. They are yours. They belong here." Eleanor took the framed photograph from his hands. The cottage in the photograph looked almost exactly the same as the cottage behind her now did. The water wheel was the same shape. The roof of the mill was sound. She looked up at him. "Mr. Wexler, these are wonderful." Daniel, the foundation is going to want copies of these for the historical archive. With your permission." "They have my permission. I would also like, with your permission, to donate something else. I have a crew. We are between projects. I would like to offer them to the foundation for 1 week, free of charge, to do whatever construction or restoration work is most needed. We can frame walls. We can pour concrete. We can do whatever is useful. Eleanor, let me do something larger than putting down a paddle." Eleanor studied his face. "Daniel, I will speak to David Carmichael. I expect the answer will be yes." He nodded once. "Thank you." He turned to go. "Daniel." "Yes. My husband used to say. He used to say there is no such thing as a small kindness. Only kindnesses that have not yet finished being kind. You put down your paddle. The kindness has not finished being kind yet. It may not be finished for years. I want you to hold on to that." Daniel Wexler stood by his truck for a moment. He looked at the mill. He looked at Eleanor. He got in his truck and drove away. Eleanor stood at the fence with the framed photograph in her hand. Henry came back across the yard. Eleanor. He brought photographs. His grandfather took photographs of every mill in the county between 1945 and 1962. He has 6 of this mill. He wants the foundation to have them. He also wants to lend his construction crew for a week. Henry looked at her. Eleanor. What? You handled that man better than I would have. Henry. He put down his paddle. That mattered. Henry shook his head. Eleanor. You are something. He picked up his hammer. They went back to work on the fence. Dr. Rachel Pennington came 2 weeks after the Green family visit, on a Wednesday afternoon. In a black sedan she drove herself. She was 62 years old, tall, with silver-streaked black hair cut short. She wore a simple linen dress and walking shoes. She got out of the car alone. She had not brought a lawyer. She had not brought an assistant. She walked up to the porch with a small canvas bag over her shoulder and a paper grocery bag in her arms. Eleanor met her at the steps. Mrs. Briggs. Eleanor. Please. Eleanor. Rachel. They shook hands. Rachel set the paper grocery bag on the porch. She lifted out, very carefully, a covered glass dish. My grandmother's peach cobbler recipe, Rachel said. I made it this morning. I hope you like cobbler. I do. And I brought one other thing. She lifted from the canvas bag a small leather pouch, older than the pouches in the chest, worn smooth at the edges. She held it in both her hands for a moment. Eleanor. My great-grandmother brought one thing out of slavery with her in 1864. Just one thing. She carried it in her shoe across 2 states. Her mother had given it to her on the day she was sold away from her, when my great-grandmother was 11 years old. She kept it all her life. It went to her daughter, my grandmother, who left it to my mother, who left it to me. I am the last in the line of women who has carried it. I have no daughter. My brother has 2 daughters, but they did not grow up with the story. I have been wondering, for 15 years, what to do with this. I have wondered if I should donate it to a museum. I have wondered if I should give it to one of my brother's daughters and hope she understands. I have not been able to decide. She placed the leather pouch on Eleanor's table. Eleanor, after I read about you, after I read about the chest, after I read about what you did, I knew what to do. She opened the pouch. Inside was a small carved wooden figure. A bird, perhaps a sparrow, perhaps a finch, no bigger than Eleanor's thumb. Cherry wood, polished by 160 years of handling. The wings folded close. The eye carved with the smallest possible point. My great-great-grandmother carved this, Rachel said. She was a woman who could not read or write, who lived and died enslaved, who never met her own grandchildren. She carved this for her daughter. She gave it to her on the day they took her away. She told her, this is a free bird. As long as you carry it, you are not alone. As long as you carry it, you remember that I made you to be free. My great-grandmother carried this bird for 56 years. She held it in her hand when she died. She told her daughter, my grandmother, whoever carries this is the one who keeps the freedom of our family alive. Rachel pushed the bird across the table to Eleanor. Eleanor, I want you to be the next person who carries it. I want you to keep it on this property. I do not want it in a museum. I do not want it on a shelf in my house. I want it here, where the family came through. I want my great-great-grandmother to come back to where her grandson was taken in. I want you to keep her safe for me. Eleanor looked at the bird. She did not pick it up for a moment. Rachel. Eleanor. This is too much. This is more than I can. Rachel. Eleanor. It is a wooden bird. It will sit on your mantle. You will dust it once a week. You will, when you are old, give it to whoever comes next. You will not do anything special. You will just keep it. That is all I am asking. I am asking you to keep it. Eleanor picked up the bird. It was lighter than she had expected. The wood had been worn smooth by so many fingers over so many years that it felt almost soft, almost like skin. The carving was simple, but the eye was extraordinarily precise. Whoever had made it had known how to look at a bird. Rachel, I will keep it. Thank you. I will keep it on the mantle of the cottage. I will give it back to your family when I am old. I will write down in my will exactly who is to receive it. Eleanor, I trust you to do that. They sat down at the table. They ate peach cobbler with a spoon directly from the dish, because Rachel said her grandmother had always served it that way. They talked for 3 hours. About the foundation. About Rachel's career as a surgeon. About her marriage to a man who had died of cancer 6 years earlier. About her grown son who lived in Oakland and her daughter-in-law who was a kind woman, but a private one. About the way grief and money do not solve each other, and the way grief and meaning sometimes do. When Rachel got up to leave, she stood at the porch railing and looked at the mill for a long time. Eleanor. Yes. It is going to be all right. The mill. The foundation. The work. I came down today wondering if I had made the right decision with the donation. I am driving back home certain that I did. Rachel. You did. I will see you in the fall. At the dedication. I will see you in the fall. Rachel walked down the porch steps. She stopped at the bottom and turned. Eleanor. My grandmother. The teacher in Toronto. She used to say something. She used to say, the bird is free even when the cage is locked, because the bird remembers it had wings. I have thought about that sentence my whole life. I think you have wings, Eleanor. I think you have had them all along. She got in her car. She drove away. Eleanor stood on the porch with the cherrywood bird in her palm. She thought, for a long moment, about Walter. She walked into the cottage. She put the bird on the mantel above the fireplace, next to her wedding photograph from 1968. She stepped back. The bird was very small. The photograph was very small. The mantel was not large. But they fit together. They fit very well. Brian came back 2 weekends later, on a Saturday morning, in the Lexus SUV, with Vanessa and both their children in the car. Tyler, the son who had moved back from college, was 23, lean, dark-haired, with his father's jaw and his mother's careful eyes. Madison, the daughter, was 17, in her last year of high school, with a phone in her hand that she put away the moment her father parked the car. They had brought a load of tools in the back of the Lexus. Tyler, whose summer job at a marketing firm had not yet started for the season, had asked Brian if he could spend his free weeks helping his grandmother. Madison had asked the same thing. Brian had agreed without being asked twice. Eleanor was on the porch when they pulled up. Tyler got out of the car first. She had not seen Tyler in 11 years. The last time she had seen him, he had been 12 years old and shorter than she was. He was now 6 feet tall. He walked up the steps and stood in front of her. Grandma. Tyler. Grandma. I am very sorry I have not been a better grandson. Eleanor reached up and put her hand on his face. He had to bend slightly for her to do it. She held his cheek for a moment. Tyler, you are here now. That is what matters. Come inside. Margaret left blueberry muffins this morning. Madison came up next. She was a tall girl, taller than her mother, with her hair in a long braid down her back. She did not say much, but she hugged her grandmother and did not let go for several seconds longer than Eleanor had expected. When Madison stepped back, she said, Grandma, I read everything I could find about the mill, about the Underground Railroad, about the Green family. I have so many questions. Eleanor smiled. Honey, I have answers to some of them. The rest we can figure out together. Brian and Vanessa came up the steps behind the children. Brian was carrying a covered dish. Vanessa had a bouquet of garden flowers wrapped in newspaper. Mom, Brian said, where do you want us? Inside. We will eat. Then Tyler can help Henry with the porch railing. Madison can help me sort through some letters that arrived yesterday from a researcher in Ohio. Vanessa, if you do not mind, Margaret is coming over at 1, and she wanted to teach somebody how to can blackberry jam, and she was hoping for an apprentice. Vanessa laughed. I have never canned anything in my life. That is exactly why Margaret wants you. She likes a fresh student. Vanessa smiled. It was the first real smile Eleanor had seen on her face in over 20 years. The weekend unfolded the way all the good weekends would unfold for the rest of Eleanor's life. Tyler worked with Henry on the porch railing and on a new section of fence along the road. Madison sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor and helped sort through letters. Vanessa canned blackberry jam with Margaret and burned her hand once on the canning pot and laughed about it afterwards in a way that made Eleanor realize she had never heard Vanessa laugh like that, easy and unguarded, in all the years she had known her. Brian helped his mother. He did not make a show of it. He did not announce that he was helping. He just did things. He cleaned the gutters on the cottage. He sharpened the tools in Henry's truck for Henry while Henry was working on the railing with Tyler. He drove into town and bought groceries with his own money and did not mention it. On Sunday evening, before they left, Brian came and sat next to his mother on the porch step. Mom, yes, I want to drive down every other weekend, through the summer, if that is all right. That is all right. And I would like to talk to you about something else. All right. He took a breath. Mom, the bankruptcy. I did not file. I figured out a way through it. It is not pretty, and it is going to take me a couple of years to dig out. But I did not file. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to tell you because I had not, and I wanted you to know I was being honest with you now. Even the parts that are not done yet. Even the parts one I'm still trying to fix. Eleanor looked at her son. Brian, thank you for telling me. Mom, yes. I'm going to talk to Tyler about the apartment over the dry cleaner. The story you told me. About how you had to leave. I do not want him to grow up not knowing. I want him to know what his grandmother did. I want him to know what almost happened. And I want him to know I almost let it happen. Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. Brian, you do not have to tell him that. You do not have to do that to yourself. Mom, I want him to know. I want both of them to know. I am not going to be the kind of father who hides his failures from his children. That is how I became the kind of son who did not pick up the phone. I learned that from my own father, who was a wonderful man, but who never told me he was struggling. I do not want to do that. I want Tyler to know I have struggled. I want him to know I have failed. I want him to know I have been forgiven. I want him to know what that looks like. Eleanor looked at her son. She felt, again, the 100 things at once. She put her hand on his. Brian, you have grown. He squeezed her hand. Mom, so have you. The dedication of the mill happened in October, on a Saturday afternoon, 5 months after Eleanor had bought it. It was the 2nd of October, to be exact. Eleanor had asked David Carmichael if the ceremony could be on that date. She had not told him why. He had agreed without asking. The 2nd of October was Walter's birthday. He would have been 78. The Historical Commission had spent the summer working with a contractor specializing in 19th century restoration. The roof of the mill had been repaired with proper hand-split cedar shingles to match the original. The water wheel had been rebuilt by a craftsman from Vermont who specialized in mill restoration and who had taken the job at a reduced rate because he had seen the news story and wanted to be part of it. The water wheel did not yet turn for grain. That would take another year of work, but it turned in the current, and the sound of it turning, slow and steady, was the sound that had been missing from the property for 54 years. The cottage had been fully restored. Plumbing, electrical, a new chimney, a real roof. Eleanor had moved out of the sleeping bag and into the small back bedroom on a real bed with real sheets. She had a kitchen with a stove that worked on propane and a small refrigerator that hummed in the corner. The foundation, the Green Hadley Foundation, had been formally established in July. It had a board of 7, including Imani, Theodore Green, the anonymous donor Dr. Rachel Pennington, David Carmichael from the Historical Commission, Eleanor herself, Henry Aldridge as a representative of the local community, and a historian from Howard University named Dr. Aaron Lassiter, who had volunteered to chair the Underground Railroad Research Committee. Eleanor's role with the foundation was caretaker and resident scholar-in-residence. The phrase had been Theodore's. It paid her a salary of $42,000 a year. The trust set aside for her personally by the Green family produced an additional $18,000 a year in income. She had, for the first time in her life, enough money to live without counting the pennies. She still counted the pennies. That was not going to change. The dedication ceremony was set for 2 in the afternoon. By 1 o'clock, the gravel drive was full of cars and the meadow on the far side of the creek had been turned into a makeshift parking lot by Pete the retired carpenter, who had volunteered to direct traffic with a yellow vest and a hand-painted sign. 317 people came. They came from all over. Family members of the names in the ledger, from 7 states and 3 provinces. Historians from 4 universities. The 2 reporters who had been there on day 3, both invited personally by Eleanor. Walt Pemberton from the hardware store with his wife. Donna Pritchett, who had come up to Eleanor at the door of the cottage that morning with tears in her eyes and asked if she could just shake her hand. Karen from the post office. The pastor of the church Eleanor and Walter had gone to. The young woman who had given Eleanor the paper cup of coffee in the Methodist church parking lot 6 months earlier. Eleanor had tracked her down through the church directory and invited her personally. Her name was Teresa. She had brought her 2 small children and a casserole. Brian and Vanessa and Tyler and Madison had driven down on Friday and slept in the cottage with Eleanor. They had spent Friday evening helping set up tables and chairs in the meadow. Beatrice Webb-Daniels had come. Her grandson had driven her down from Halifax. She was 84 years old and walked with a cane and refused to sit during the ceremony. even though Eleanor had set aside a chair for her in the front row. She stood the whole time, leaning on her cane, with her grandson's hand on her elbow. Imani spoke first. She stood on the porch of the cottage and spoke into a small microphone Pete had rigged up to a portable speaker. She talked about her grandmother. She talked about the notebook. She talked about the long Thursday afternoon when she had gotten the phone call. She talked about Eleanor. When she got to the part about Eleanor, her voice cracked, and she had to stop for a moment. She gathered herself. "My family has had a phrase for 5 generations," Imani said, "until such day as it may serve another in need." It was the phrase Samuel Green wrote on the note he left in this chest in 1864. It was the phrase my great-grandmother quoted in her notebook. It is the phrase that has come down through 5 generations of my family, attached to a story we all knew might never have an ending. She looked out at the crowd. My family understood that phrase one way for 161 years. We understood it as a hope, as a wish that whoever found the chest someday might be a person who needed help. We never imagined what the phrase would actually mean when the day came. We never imagined that the person who needed help would also be the person who refused to take what was not hers. We never imagined that the phrase would describe not a recipient of charity, but a partnership. A family meeting another family across a century and a half and choosing, both of us together, to do something useful with what we had been given. Imani looked at Eleanor, who was sitting in a folding chair beside the porch. "Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, my family does not have words for what you have given us. So we are going to use the only words we have, until such day as it may serve another in need. That day was 3 days after you bought this property, Mrs. Briggs. The need was yours. The need was also ours. The chest served both of us. And we will be grateful. Our family will be grateful. My children's children's children will be grateful, for as long as the name Green is spoken on this earth." Imani stepped down off the porch. She walked to Eleanor. She kissed her on the forehead. She stood beside her. David Carmichael spoke next. He talked about the historical significance of the ledger. He talked about the work the foundation was already doing. He announced that the mill had been formally registered as a National Historic Site, that the listing had been approved by the Department of the Interior the previous week. He unveiled the plaque. The plaque was bronze, set into a piece of fieldstone from the property, mounted on a low pedestal near the front of the cottage. It read, "The Hadley Mill Underground Railroad Station, 1862 to 1865. 47 souls passed through this place on their journey to freedom. Their names are recorded inside. This site preserved through the partnership of the Green Hadley Foundation and the residency of Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, who found what had been hidden and chose to honor it." Eleanor stood up when David Carmichael called her name to speak. She had not prepared remarks. She had told David she would not need to speak, that the day was about the families. He had nodded and agreed, but he had added a place for her on the program anyway, and now he was looking at her with his eyebrows raised, and Eleanor understood that she could not refuse. She walked up to the microphone. She looked out at 317 people standing in the meadow across the creek and on the gravel drive and on the porch. She saw Brian. She saw Vanessa. She saw Tyler and Madison. She saw Henry and Margaret. She saw Imani's mother in her wheelchair under the oak tree. She saw Theodore with his satchel of charts. She saw Beatrice Webb Daniels standing with her grandson. She saw Walt Pemberton and Donna Pritchett and Karen from the post office. She saw Teresa, the young woman with the paper cup of coffee, holding her baby. She saw, at the back of the crowd, an older man in a polo shirt who, after a moment, she recognized as the man who had outbid her at the auction and then put down his paddle. He had come. He had read the news, and he had driven out, and he had come. Eleanor cleared her throat. "I am not going to give a speech," she said into the microphone. "I do not have one prepared, and I do not have one in me. I am going to say 4 things, and then I am going to sit down." She paused. "The first thing. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in the back seat of a 1998 Buick LeSabre in the parking lot of a Methodist church off Highway 9. I had $217 in my checking account. I had nowhere to go. I had a son who was not picking up the phone. A woman whose name I did not know brought me a paper cup of coffee one morning and did not say anything and drove away. She is here today. Teresa, will you raise your hand?" Teresa raised her hand. Her baby on her hip waved. "That cup of coffee," Eleanor said, "was the first thing anyone had given me in 6 weeks. I did not know it then, but it was the first link in a chain that ran straight to this porch. I want everybody here to know what one cup of coffee can do. She paused again. The second thing. I bought this property because it was the only piece of land I could afford. I did not buy it because I knew what was inside. I did not buy it because I was wise or brave or particularly clear-headed. I bought it because I was desperate and a clerk at the county office told me about a tax sale that nobody else wanted. I want everybody here to know that I did not earn what came after. I was given it. I was given it by a man named Josiah Hadley 161 years ago when he chose to keep a chest safe for a family that needed it. I was given it by Samuel and Hannah Green when they had the wisdom to write a note in 1864 that said the chest should serve another in need. I was given it by a county clerk who took the time to look up a listing for an old woman who looked like she needed land. I have been given everything that has happened on this property. I have earned almost none of it. I want that on the record. A small silence in the crowd. The third thing. To the family of Samuel and Hannah Green. To the family of Cassius Webb. To the families of Mary and Joseph Pinchback and the Cole family and Lucinda and her daughter and in every other name in that ledger. I want you to know. Your people slept here. Your people ate here. Your people were cared for here by a stranger who took a risk because it was the right thing to do. The walls of this mill remember them. The stones in the foundation remember them. The water in the creek remembers them. I have been told by Imani's mother that this property has held those memories all this time, waiting for the family to come back. The family has come back. The family is here. The walls and the stones and the water are very glad about that. I am very glad about that. Whatever I am the caretaker of, I am the caretaker of those memories. I take that seriously. I will take that seriously every day for the rest of my life. She looked down at the porch boards for a moment. She looked back up. The fourth thing. My husband Walter Briggs would have been 78 years old today. He died 11 years ago. He was a good man. He was a quiet man. He worked for the railroad for 41 years. He never made a lot of money. He never did anything that anybody would put on a plaque. He was a man who picked his wife up at the bus stop in the rain. He was a man who put the porch step right when it got loose. He was a man who left a wildflower in a juice glass on the kitchen counter every wedding anniversary for 46 years. He would have loved this mill. He would have loved this porch. He would have loved every single person standing in this meadow today. I chose October 2nd for this ceremony because it is his birthday. I wanted him to be here for it. I think, in whatever way these things work, he is. Walter, happy birthday. She stepped back from the microphone. The crowd was very still. Then someone in the back started to clap. Eleanor could not see who. The clapping spread. It moved through the meadow and across the creek and back. Up to the porch, and Eleanor stood there with her hands folded in front of her, and she let them clap, because she had nowhere else to look and nothing else to do. When the clapping ended, she went and sat back down in her folding chair. Brian, in the row behind her, reached forward and put his hand on her shoulder. She put her hand over his. The rest of the ceremony went the way ceremonies go. Theodore read the 47 names from the ledger one at a time. After each name, a member of the corresponding family, where one had been identified, stood up. Some of them had brought small photographs of their ancestors and held them up. Some of them said a few words. Beatrice Webb Daniels stood when Cassius Webb's name was read. She did not say anything. She just stood, and her grandson held her elbow, and she lifted her chin so that everyone could see her face, and the silence in the meadow was the kind of silence that has more in it than most speeches. The ceremony ended at 4. Food came out. There was food enough for 500 people, because everyone had brought something. There was barbecue from a black church in Philadelphia that had sent a contingent. There were sweet potatoes and collards from a family in Georgia. There was apple pie from Margaret. There were 3 kinds of macaroni and cheese, because at any event involving the Green family, Imani had warned Eleanor, there would always be 3 kinds of macaroni and cheese. People ate. People talked. People walked through the mill, which was open for the day, and looked at the new water wheel turning in the current. Eleanor sat on the porch with a plate of food she did not get to finish, because every few minutes someone came up to her and wanted to shake her hand or tell her a story or thank her for something. She let them. She thanked each of them in return. By 6 o'clock, the meadow had emptied. The cars had pulled out one by one. The foundation had brought a cleanup crew. Pete had taken down the yellow signs. The light was getting long. Eleanor walked down to the creek alone. She had told Brian she would be back in a few minutes. She wanted, just for a moment, to be on the bank by herself. The water was still moving past, the way it had been moving past for 2 centuries. She stood at the edge. She thought about Walter. She thought about the apartment above the dry cleaner. She thought about the Buick. She thought about the Methodist church parking lot. She thought about the auction. The laughter. Bless her heart. She doesn't know what she just bought. She thought about Henry's truck on the gravel drive the first afternoon. She thought about the chest in the hoist room. The rusted lock. The smell of the old oak and the older leather. She thought about Imani standing in front of her in the cottage, holding the daguerreotype, with her hand over her mouth. She thought about Brian on the porch step with his face in his hands. She thought about the dedication ceremony and her own voice at the microphone, saying things she had not known she was going to say. She did not cry. She had cried enough. She just stood at the edge of the water and let it all be true. All of it. The hard parts and the soft parts. The hunger and the abundance. The cruelty and the kindness. The years of being invisible and the long bright day she had just lived through. It was all true. It was all hers. The heron came in low over the meadow and landed at the bend, the way it had been coming every evening for 5 months. It stood very still and watched for fish. Eleanor watched the heron. "Walter," she said quietly to the moving water, "I bought a mill. I think you would have liked it." The heron lifted off the water with a slow, heavy beat of its wings and flew away into the trees on the far side, and the sound of the new water wheel, turning slowly in the current, carried down the bank in the soft autumn light. And Eleanor Briggs, 70 years old now, widow, scholar in residence, caretaker of 47 names and 1 quiet building on a gravel road, walked back up to the cottage where her son and his family were waiting for her on the porch with a piece of birthday cake they had hidden in the kitchen for after the ceremony. She would live in the cottage for another 19 years. She would see Madison graduate from college and Tyler get married in the meadow across the creek and Brian retire and move down the road into a small house he and Vanessa bought 2 miles past Henry and Margaret's farm. She would see the Green Hadley Foundation identify the descendants of every name in the ledger by the time she was 78. She would see the mill grind its first ceremonial bushel of corn in 2031, 60 years after the wheel had last turned for grain. She would see Imani get her doctorate and become the executive director of the foundation. She would see Beatrice Webb Daniels die at 89 in her bed in Halifax, with a copy of the Hadley ledger entry about Cassius Webb framed on her wall. She would see all of it. And on the day she died, in the small back bedroom of the cottage at 89 years old, with Brian holding one of her hands and Imani holding the other, with the sound of the water wheel turning in the current just outside the open window, she would look at the both of them and say 1 sentence. Tell them I was the caretaker. That was all she wanted on her stone. That was what they put. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.